Silas stood on the edge of the makeshift cemetery, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. Rows of freshly turned graves stretched before him, a silent testament to the battle they had barely survived. The air was thick with the scent of soil and sorrow, the weight of loss pressing down on the gathered villagers. Mothers clutched their children, whispering reassurances they barely believed. Fathers held hats against their chests, faces carved from grief. The elderly knelt in silent prayer, their whispers carried away by the autumn wind. A group of villagers worked methodically, digging yet another grave. Their movements were slow, weary, and deliberate, as if each shovelful of dirt carried the weight of the dead with it. Sweat glistened on their brows despite the cool breeze. A wooden cross was carefully planted at the head of each mound, the names etched into the wood with trembling hands. "We'll need more crosses," a grizzled man muttered, voice gravely from grief. Silas swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his body exhausted, but there was no room for weakness. He scanned the scene. There was no shortage of work to be done. Rustbrook had survived, but at what cost? He clenched his fists, his mind replaying the battle in flashes, screams, the clash of steel, the fire that had swallowed homes. Faces blurred together, some he had saved, many he had not. The deaths bore down on his shoulders, a crushing burden that no amount of planning or foresight could ease. Across the village, children carried buckets of water to douse the last stubborn embers. Women patched fences with scraps of wood, their hands raw from work. Men sharpened weapons, their eyes hollow but determined. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. The war wasn't over. It was merely catching its breath. "This isn't over," a voice broke through Silas's thoughts. He turned to see a young woman approaching, her face streaked with dirt and dried blood. Her dark eyes burned with quiet fury, her hands balled into fists. He recognized her now. Marla, the blacksmith's daughter. Her brother Jace had fought in the battle. His grave was one of the fresh mounds behind her. "We need to be ready for when they come back," she said, her voice tight but unwavering. Silas met her gaze, taking in the grief that simmered beneath her anger. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every soul lost, for every family shattered. "We will be," he said simply, but the promise felt heavier than it should have. They walked through the village square together, moving past half-collapsed buildings and scorched earth. Life stirred around them in small but meaningful ways. An old woman tending to an injured dog, a youth crafting a crude weapon from sticks, his small fingers working with a skill no child should possess. Marla stopped near a partially collapsed barn, its roof caved in, hay scattered in darkened patches where fire had licked the edges. She turned to Silas, arms crossed over her chest. "What's our next move?" Silas exhaled, scanning the ruin around him. Rustbrook stood, but barely. The defenses had held, but just enough to delay the inevitable. "We rebuild," he said finally, "and we prepare." The words came easy, but in the back of his mind, doubt gnawed at him. He had seen the way the enemy fought, merciless, relentless. And somewhere beyond the tree line, past the graves and the ruins, he could feel eyes watching, waiting. Silas straightened his shoulders, pushing the unease away. There was no room for doubt. For now, they would honor the dead. And when the enemy returned, they would be ready. Rustbrook stood battered but unbroken, a living testament to its people's indomitable spirit. The atmosphere carried traces of aged paper, perspiration, and stale ash, evidence of the flames that had threatened to consume the town's perimeter earlier that week. Inside, Thomas hunched over a table strewn with maps, hastily scribbled notes, and half-melted candles. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his fingers absently tracing battle lines drawn in charcoal. Across from him, Elder Miriam sat still, eyes closed, as if in deep thought, or perhaps prayer. The moment Silas entered, they both looked up. "We need a plan." His voice was steady, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. He moved toward the table, scanning the worn maps. Tomas nodded grimly and pushed a map forward. "We've marked where they hit the hardest, food stores, water sources." His jaw tightened. "They know exactly where to hurt us." Elder Miriam opened her eyes, their gray depths carrying the weight of a dozen wars before this one. "We must safeguard what little we have left," she murmured. Silas ran his finger along the map, stopping at key locations. "We need to fortify these areas immediately. Double the guards at night and set up lookouts on the surrounding hills. We can't afford to be caught off guard again." Tomas leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "That's a start, but what about supplies? We're running low on everything: food, medicine, even wood for repairs. We're barely standing as it is." A frustrated breath escaped Silas. "We'll dispatch search teams to check the surrounding settlements, find out if they're willing to barter or share their resources." Elder Miriam dipped her head in measured agreement. "Our past friendships might benefit us now, but hardship transforms folks, Silas, including former allies." Silas met her gaze. He knew the truth in her words. Hunger made men into thieves. Fear made them into killers. "Even so, we have to try," he said. A long pause stretched between them before Elder Miriam gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'll reach out to the Council of Elders. They may listen to me where they wouldn't listen to others." Silas allowed himself a flicker of gratitude. "Your influence may be what keeps us from starving, Elder Miriam. Thank you." The elder woman offered a faint smile, not of hope, but of understanding. Tomas grabbed a scrap of parchment and scrawled a list. "We also need to think beyond survival. Rebuilding defenses isn't enough. We need sustainability, crops that can grow in harsh conditions, clean water sources that don't rely on fragile wells." "Agreed," Silas said. "We should consult the artisans, the herbalists, see if they can come up with something that gives us an edge." Elder Miriam reached out, placing a hand on Silas's arm. Her touch was light but firm, grounding him in the moment. "Remember," she said quietly, "our strength lies in unity. If we let fear divide us, we've already lost." Silas nodded, the weight of responsibility settling deeper into his bones. "We will stand together," he vowed. Tomas glanced between them before giving a final, determined nod. "Then let's get to work." As Silas, Tomas, and Elder Miriam stepped out of the town hall, the full weight of Rustbrook's struggle crashed down on them. The village was a patchwork of desperation, walls hastily patched with scrap wood, smoke still curling from the remains of smoldering fires, and the sharp scent of sweat and blood hanging in the air. Villagers moved through the wreckage with grim determination, their faces set in the kind of hardened exhaustion that came from living on the edge of survival. Some tended to the wounded, others hauled salvage supplies, and a few worked in silence to reinforce the battered barricades. Yet tension simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. By the water source, heated words erupted, sharp and bitter with resentment. Before Silas could make sense of the situation, one of the villagers emerged from the crowd, thrusting a work-worn hand accusingly toward him. "This is all his fault," the man spat. His face was lined with fatigue, but his fury burned bright. "We were peaceful before he showed up." A woman with dirt-streaked cheeks and sunken eyes nodded vigorously. "He's brought this war to our doorstep. We were safe until he came." Silas stopped in his tracks, the weight of their words pressing down on him like the debris of a collapsing building. For the first time since the battle, the bruises on his body felt dull compared to the wounds in their voices. Tomas tensed beside him, his hand instinctively hovering near his belt. Elder Miriam, ever steady, placed a reassuring hand on Silas's arm. "Silas," she murmured, a quiet anchor against the tide of hostility. The man who had spoken first stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. His knuckles were raw. Whether from labor or battle, it was hard to tell. "What do you have to say for yourself?" His voice was rough, laced with the kind of anger that came from loss. "Why should we trust you now?" Silas held his ground, forcing himself to meet the man's furious glare. He could hear the quiet rustle of movement as more villagers gathered, drawn to the confrontation. "I understand your anger," he said, his voice even despite the turmoil building in his chest. "But I didn't bring this war here. It found us all." A sharp scoff cut through the tension. "How convenient." The woman's voice was thick with skepticism, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You're just trying to save your own skin." Tomas stepped forward then, his voice calm but firm. "Silas has done nothing but fight for this village. He's out there risking his life, same as the rest of us. If you think standing alone will save Rustbrook, you're wrong." Elder Miriam nodded, her presence commanding respect even among the angry crowd. "Blaming each other will not rebuild our homes. It will not fill our food stores. It will not stop the next attack." The man exhaled sharply, his rage flickering like a candle in the wind. He crossed his arms, still glaring, but there was hesitation now, uncertainty creeping into his expression. Silas took a slow step forward. Stillness descended on the plaza, weighted with unvoiced fears. The tension hung delicate and precarious, as if a single misspoken phrase might destroy it all. At last, the woman released a sigh and tilted her head. "All right." The intensity in her gaze softened, giving way to guarded suspicion. "But don't think we won't keep an eye on you." Gradually, the townspeople dispersed, their fury not extinguished, but temporarily quieted, at least for the moment. Silas stood there a moment longer, his body rigid, the tension slow to leave his muscles. He felt Thomas's steady presence beside him and Elder Miriam's quiet support. "Thank you," he murmured, though the words felt hollow. Thomas shrugged, his expression unreadable. "We need every hand we can get, even the reluctant ones." Elder Miriam squeezed Silas's arm gently before releasing it. "Keep doing what you're doing," she advised. "Time has a way of revealing truth, even to those who refuse to see it now." Silas nodded, but as he watched the villagers disappear into the wreckage of their home, he knew trust was something that had to be rebuilt, just like Rustbrook itself. The dim light of the jail flickered weakly, casting long, fractured shadows along the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old blood. Orianthe sat with an infuriating air of nonchalance, her wrists bound in rough rope, ankles shackled to the leg of the wooden bench. She tilted her head back slightly, studying the ceiling as if her captivity was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Silas stood before her, his stance rigid. The dim glow from the lantern at his side carved sharp edges into his expression. "Why did you come to Rustbrook?" His voice was low, steady, but laced with a quiet threat. Orianthe's lips curled into a smirk, her emerald eyes gleaming with something between amusement and defiance. "Wouldn't you like to know?" She exhaled, tilting her head as if the question itself was tedious. "I was curious about your supplies." "Curious?" Silas's patience thinned, his arms folded across his chest, but his eyes never left hers. "You were seen mapping our defenses." Orianthe gave a slow shrug, the movement fluid despite the bindings around her wrists. "Maybe I like knowing things." Thomas, standing off to the side, let out a sharp breath, arms crossed over his chest. His tone was cold. "If you're working with the raiders, now's the time to speak up." Orianthe's gaze flicked toward him, unbothered, before shifting back to Silas. "Then why not tell us what you know?" Silas pressed, stepping closer. A long pause. Then, ever so slowly, Orianthe's smirk deepened. Instead of answering, she let her eyes roam the room as if taking in every inch of her surroundings for the first time. "You think this place can hold out against another attack?" Her tone was light, almost mocking. Silas's shoulders squared. "It will, if we know what's coming." She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Ah, but knowledge is power, isn't it?" Tomas's patience snapped. He stepped forward, voice sharp. "Enough riddles. Do you know when they'll strike next?" Orianthe finally leaned forward, the chains at her ankles rattling slightly. Her eyes met Thomas's, and for the first time, her playfulness faded, replaced by something sharper, something calculated. "I might." The room tensed, the air thickening with unsaid words. Silas exchanged a quick glance with Thomas before returning his focus to Orianthe. He could feel it now, the way she controlled the conversation, twisting it into a game of give and take. "Then tell us," he said. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched long enough to become unbearable. Then, finally, she exhaled and leaned back against the cold stone wall. "They have plans," she murmured, each word deliberate. "Big plans." Silas didn't flinch. "What kind of plans?" Orianthe's smirk returned, but this time it wasn't just amusement. It was something more dangerous. Plans that could change everything for Rustbrook, and for you. Thomas shifted beside him, his hands balling into fists, frustration evident in the rigid line of his shoulders. Silas studied Orianthe, watching the way she controlled her breathing, her expressions, her words, always giving just enough, but never too much. "You know more than you're letting on," he said finally. She met his gaze, unblinking. "Maybe I do." Silas let out a slow breath, stepping back. He needed to think, needed to decide whether she was more valuable as a prisoner or something else entirely. And all the while, Orianthe just watched him, smiling. Silas paced the length of the dimly lit room, his footsteps echoing off the wooden floor. Orianthi's cryptic words gnawed at him, burrowing deep into the marrow of his thoughts. Tomas stood near the table, arms crossed, his usual stoic expression darkened by unspoken worry. Across from him, Elder Miriam sat still, her sharp eyes tracking Silas's movements. They were running out of time. "We can't wait," Silas said at last, his voice steady, resolute. The hesitation, the strategizing, the hoping it would be enough, those luxuries were gone. Rustbrook must upgrade its defenses before it's too late. Tomas gave a sharp nod, uncrossing his arms. "I agree. We've seen what the raiders are capable of. We barely survived last time. If we don't prepare now, we won't survive the next." Elder Miriam exhaled slowly, fingers laced together as she studied Silas. Her silence carried weight, the kind earned by years of watching settlements rise and fall. "What do you propose, Silas?" He stopped pacing, turning to them with the full force of his conviction. "First, we secure the essentials, our food and water. We double the watch on our supplies and fortify storage areas. If they can't starve us out, we hold the advantage. Then we rally everyone," Silas said firmly. "This isn't just about defending against another raid, it's about ensuring Rustbrook's survival." Elder Miriam nodded slowly, but there was hesitation in her eyes. "Survival will take more than just walls and weapons. We need allies. If we pool our resources, we stand a chance." Silas clenched his jaw. He had thought the same, but he also knew the risk. "Yes," he admitted, "but we can't stretch ourselves too thin. If we send for help and get no answer, we lose valuable time." "Time we may not have," Thomas muttered grimly. Still, Elder Miriam straightened, her decision made. "I will send word. Some of the old alliances may still hold." Silas exhaled, nodding. It was a gamble, but one they had to take. A beat of silence settled between them before Silas spoke again, his tone lowering. "There's one more thing." Thomas and Elder Miriam both turned toward him, waiting. "We need a plan for evacuation if things go south." Tomas's gaze darkened slightly, but after a moment, he nodded. No one wanted to plan for failure, but they had seen too many villages wiped from existence to ignore the possibility. "I'll speak with the villagers," Thomas said. "We need volunteers for lookout shifts and construction crews immediately. And I'll reach out to our allies," Elder Miriam added. "We cannot do this alone." Silas took in the room one last time. They were battered, running on hope and desperation, but Rustbrook was not broken. Not yet. "We start immediately." They left the town hall together, moving with the shared weight of what lay ahead. Rustbrook had made its choice. They would not go down without a fight. The sun hung low in the sky, bleeding orange and crimson across the horizon as a distant caravan approached. Dust rose in thick plumes, swirling in the evening breeze, marking the arrival of allies, or, at the very least, opportunity. Silas stood at the edge of Rustbrook, flanked by Thomas and Elder Miriam. The three of them watched in silence as the procession rumbled through the main gate, the rhythmic clatter of hooves and wagon wheels breaking the quiet hum of the village. The caravan carried more than just supplies. It carried the weight of a promise, reinforcements from Old Pruis Lookout. Villagers paused in their work, tools slack in their hands, eyes tracking the newcomers, some with curiosity, others with the guarded skepticism of survivors who had learned not to trust too easily. A broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar slicing across his cheek dismounted from his horse and strode forward. His presence commanded attention, not just from his men, but from Rustbrook's wary defenders. "Name's Garrick," he said, extending a firm hand. His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen his share of blood and fire. "Heard you could use some help." Silas clasped his hand, gripping tightly. "Silas, welcome to Rustbrook. We're grateful for your support." Garrick's sharp gaze swept over the settlement, noting the rough-hewn barricades, the half-finished watchtowers, the villagers moving like restless ants, preparing for the next inevitable fight. "Looks like you've been busy," he remarked. Tomas, standing beside Silas, let out a dry chuckle. "No choice. The raiders forced our hand." Garrick gave a slow nod, his expression darkening. "Well, we're here now. Let's get to work." The caravan came alive as supplies were offloaded. Crates of food, barrels of water, stacks of wood and stone, and bundles of weapons that glinted under the dying light. From the center of the village, Elder Miriam stood tall, orchestrating the distribution of supplies with quiet authority. "Make sure every family gets what they need," she instructed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "No hoarding, no wasting." Silas and Garrick walked through the village together, their boots kicking up dust as they took in the transformation before them. Together, they watched as Rustbrook evolved, not just into a village defending itself, but into a settlement ready for war. New barricades rose around key areas, reinforced with sturdy beams and stacked stones. Watchtowers were equipped with signal fires, bells rigged to sound alarms, and lookouts with keen eyes scanning the tree line. Children, their faces streaked with dust and sweat, rushed about carrying water and food to workers, fetching tools for blacksmiths and carpenters. They weren't just playing at war, they understood what was coming. A shared determination filled the air. No one had to say it out loud. Rustbrook had barely begun adjusting to the fighters from Old Priest Lookout when the sound of distant footsteps and wagon wheels echoed beyond the village gates. Another group had arrived. Silas stood near the barricades, watching as a diverse mix of survivors, ex-soldiers, and engineers approached. Their clothes were worn, their faces weathered by hardship, but their eyes burned with purpose. A tall woman strode to the front of the group, her steely gaze cutting through the gathering dusk. Her stance was firm, authoritative, a leader who had seen battle and survived it. "I'm Calla," she announced, voice steady, no trace of hesitation. "We've come to help." Silas stepped forward, relief and curiosity flickering across his face. "Silas, we're grateful for any assistance." Calla's gaze swept over the village, taking in the patchwork barricades, the villagers working tirelessly to turn Rustbrook into something stronger. Behind her, an older man with graying hair, sharp eyes, and a tool belt slung over his shoulder stepped up. His hands were rough, calloused, hands that had built and repaired, that had worked through disaster before. "Name's Harland," he said with a small nod. "Heard you could use some engineering expertise." Silas shook his hand, grip firm. "More than you know." Harland turned to his engineers and gestured. Without hesitation, they fanned out, assessing the village's defenses, running their hands over barricades, testing weak points, murmuring amongst themselves. Meanwhile, the ex-soldiers moved with trained precision, falling in step with Rustbrook's defenders and the warriors from Old Priest Lookout. Their rigid postures and sharp eyes spoke volumes. These were men and women who had known war, who had already made their peace with it. Tomas wasted no time integrating them into the existing guard rotations, his voice cutting through the night as he issued assignments. Calla joined Silas and Garrick. "We can reinforce your barricades with metal plating," she said, tracing her finger over key locations on the perimeter, "and set up a more effective alarm system, tripwires, flares, sound traps." Garrick gave an approving nod. "We were just discussing that earlier. What specific improvements do you have in mind?" Calla unrolled a detailed map, the parchment creased from countless hours of study. She pointed to strategic locations. "Here, here, and here, your weak points. Raiders will exploit them unless we reinforce these areas first." Silas leaned in, absorbing every detail. She spoke with certainty, with experience. "How soon can we get started?" he asked. Harlan's engineers were already deep in discussion, sketching out fortification designs on scraps of parchment. Villagers clustered around them, eager to assist, hungry to learn. The older engineer raised his head. "We start tonight," he said simply. Elder Miriam stood nearby, watching it all unfold with a keen, knowing eye. Her presence alone ensured that no resource would be wasted, no effort misplaced. The scattered remnants of the old world, the fighters, the engineers, the survivors who refused to be broken, were coming together to forge something stronger. Calla met his gaze, measuring him, testing him. "Your people are determined," she said. Silas glanced around, taking in the sight of villagers and warriors working side by side, the glow of torches flickering against their faces. "They have to be," he answered. Rustbrook had once been vulnerable, but now it was becoming a fortress. Rustbrook bustled with new energy, but not all its people shared in the optimism that swept through the village. Whispers of distrust slithered between workstations, weaving their way through groups of villagers like an invisible undercurrent. Many villagers watched the outsiders warily, their furrowed brows and hardened expressions betraying their misgivings. In their midst loomed Trapper, a broad-shouldered figure whose decades stalking prey had given him an almost primal sense for danger, someone who relied on instinct rather than promises. That instinct screamed of trouble ahead. "Not buying their act," Trapper growled under his breath, folding his muscled arms while he observed Harland and his crew strengthening the wall. Silas, sensing the tension, approached him with measured steps. "Trapper," he greeted, nodding toward the ongoing fortifications. "We need every bit of help we can get." Trapper grunted, his expression stony. "Help or not, they're strangers. We don't know their true intentions." Silas understood the caution. Rustbrook had been burned before. "Come with me," he said, offering no argument, only a chance to see for himself. "Let's inspect the defenses together. You'll see they're making a difference." A pause. Trapper's jaw tightened, but after a moment he gave a curt nod. "Fine, but I trust my own eyes more than their promises." They moved through the village, winding past half-repaired walls and hastily erected barriers. The defenses stood tall, but in places they stood weak. Trapper stopped suddenly, pointing toward a makeshift watchtower that leaned precariously. "That won't hold if there's another attack," he said bluntly. Silas frowned, noting how the base wobbled slightly with the breeze. Calla had already suggested reinforcing it with metal plating, but until then it was a liability waiting to collapse. "We'll reinforce it," Silas said, but Trapper's silence made it clear he wouldn't be convinced with words alone. Further along, they reached a half-dug trench, abandoned when materials had run out. Trapper let out a harsh breath. "Half measures won't save us," Silas nodded. "That's why we need them. Calla and her people bring skills and resources we lack." Trapper didn't answer, but his eyes lingered on the trench longer than necessary. They pressed on. At the southern barricade, Harland and his engineers were hard at work, layering metal sheets onto the wooden defenses. Sparks flew from hammers striking iron, and the rhythmic pounding echoed through the village like a war drum. Trapper's gaze lingered on the distant figures of Calla's engineers, the soldiers from Old Pruis, and the Rustbrook villagers working side by side. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, with a slight nod, he muttered, "We'll see." The words weren't trust, but they weren't rejection either, and for now, that was enough. Blueprints, maps, and scrawled notes lay scattered across the wooden table, their edges curling with use. Harland stood at the head of the gathering, his hands braced on the tabletop. Silas, Calla, Thomas, and Elder Miriam sat around him, their expressions a mix of skepticism and intrigue. Harland tapped a worn, faded section of the map where the remnants of a long-abandoned outpost were marked. "We need to discuss scavenging this installation," he began, his voice steady but urgent. "It's an old military site, mostly forgotten, but if the rumors are true, it could have tech that will change everything for us." Calla leaned in, her sharp gaze locked onto the map. "What kind of tech?" Harland exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Generators, surveillance systems, maybe even automated defenses if we're lucky." Silas studied the map, tracing his finger along the route. "How far?" "Half a day's journey," Harland answered. "We'd need to move fast and keep low. Raiders might be sniffing around it too." Tomas crossed his arms, skeptical. "And you're sure this place hasn't been picked clean already?" Harland shrugged, but his confidence didn't waver. "Maybe. But we can't keep patching holes forever. We need something real, something that can turn Rustbrook into a fortress, not just a holdout. Elder Miriam's calm but measured gaze moved between Harland and Silas. If this outpost holds even a fraction of what you're hoping for, it could mean the difference between holding out and falling apart. A heavy pause settled over the group. Silas finally nodded, his decision made. We'll send a small team, fast, quiet, and capable, no unnecessary risks. Kala exchanged glances with Harland before speaking. I'll go. I'll bring 2 of my best engineers. We'll need them if we find something valuable. Silas tapped his knuckles against the table, thinking, we also need someone who knows the terrain, someone who can get us in and out before we draw attention. A name came to mind before he even finished speaking. Trapper. Thomas raised an eyebrow, while Kala simply listened, expression unreadable. He's still wary of our newcomers, Silas admitted, but if he sees the value of what we're after, sees them in action, he might come around. Harland nodded. We could use his instincts out there. Elder Miriam leaned forward, her fingers steepled together. While you're gone, we'll push forward with our fortifications. But be cautious. Our resources are stretched thin as it is. We can't afford to lose people. Kala glanced at Silas. We leave at first light. The fire pit crackled in the cold night air, its embers pulsing like a heartbeat. Trapper sat beside it, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Silas approached without preamble, his voice even. There's an outpost. Trapper didn't look up, but the slight pause in his movements told Silas he was listening. Harland believes it holds military tech, generators, defenses, surveillance. If we can get our hands on it, we can fortify Rustbrook for real. Trapper finally glanced up, his gaze shadowed by flickering firelight. And? We need someone who knows the land, Silas said simply. You in? Silence. Then, in one slow, measured motion, Trapper sheathed his knife and stood, rolling his shoulders. Fine, his voice was gruff, unreadable, but I'm keeping my eye on them. A small smirk ghosted across Silas's lips. That was as much trust as Trapper was willing to give. Fair enough. As the night deepened and the village quieted, preparations for the scavenging mission were set into motion. Dawn would bring new risks. Orianthe lounged in the corner of her cell, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, calculating. Through the narrow, barred window, she watched the recruits moving with quiet intensity, tightening straps, sharpening blades, preparing for war. A slow smirk curled at her lips. She had seen this before. Silas, making his rounds, caught the flicker of amusement on her face, his brow furrowed. Nothing about their situation was funny. With a slow exhale, he stepped toward the cell, the iron door creaking softly as he leaned against the frame. Enjoying the show? His voice was low, edged with irritation. Orianthe didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of her stare. Then, finally, she tilted her head, the smirk deepening. It's fascinating, she mused, her tone silken with mockery. Watching you make the same mistakes others have. Silas's jaw tightened. What do you mean by that? Orianthe rose from her cot and moved toward the bars, her fingers curling loosely around the cold iron. I've seen settlements like Rustbrook before, she said, her voice light, almost amused. They all think they can outlast the raiders with a few barricades and some old tech. They all think they're different. Silas's gaze darkened. And what do you suggest we do differently? A low chuckle escaped her lips, soft, almost condescending. Oh, it's not about what you should do, she murmured. It's about what you haven't done. Fraction X thrives on predictability. They know your moves before you make them because you're playing by their rules. Silas stepped closer, his voice now a quiet challenge. You talk a lot for someone locked up. Orianthe's expression didn't waver. And yet, here I am, still breathing, while others are rotting in your makeshift cemetery. The words hit harder than he expected. Silas clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to exhale. You think you know everything about Rustbrook and its people? She smiled, that infuriating, knowing smile. I know enough. A pause, letting the tension build. Enough to see you're repeating history. Silas hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Orianthe caught it. Then enlighten me, he challenged. She stepped back, her smirk widening as she sank onto the cot once more, her chains rattling softly. Why would I give away secrets for free? She said smoothly. Besides, some lessons are best learned the hard way. Silas studied her, searching for an opening, a crack in her armor. But Orianthe was a wall, unreadable, unshaken. He turned abruptly, frustration coiled in his shoulders as he strode away. Silas squared his shoulders, closing the space between himself and Orianthe's cell, his eyes locked onto hers. What would you do differently? His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it, a demand, not request. For a moment, Orianthe said nothing. Her smirk had faded, replaced by something more elusive. Just as Silas was about to press her again, he caught it, a flicker in her gaze. Regret? Insight. It was gone before he could pin it down. Orianthe turned away, crossing her arms as if shielding herself from the question itself. It doesn't matter what I would do, she said at last, her tone softer than before, less mocking. You're not me. Silas frowned. Try me. He leaned against the bars, refusing to let the conversation die there. What do you see that we don't? Orianthe's gaze drifted back to him. You won't like the answer. Silas's grip on the bars tightened. That's not for you to decide. Tell me. For the first time, a hesitation crept into her demeanor. Not out of fear. No, Orianthe didn't do fear, but as if she were weighing whether she should even bother giving him the truth. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You're too focused on defense, on holding your ground. Her voice had changed. No longer taunting, no longer testing. Just honest. But Fraction X? They're always moving. They don't defend. They strike. They adapt. They disappear before you even know where to hit back. Silas absorbed her words, his jaw tightening. She wasn't wrong. And how do we think like them? He asked. Orianthe tilted her head slightly, watching him now, testing his willingness to listen. By being unpredictable, by taking risks. She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, except it wasn't. By knowing when to fight and when to run. The last words hung in the air, heavier than the rest. Silas's stomach tightened instinctively. Rustbrook had fought to exist, to hold on to what little they had. Running wasn't in their nature. But what if that thinking got them killed? His thoughts raced, questions forming faster than he could sort them. But before he could push further, a sharp voice rang out from beyond the cell. Silas, Thomas. His voice carried an edge of urgency. Silas turned toward the door, instinct snapping back into focus. We'll continue this later, he said abruptly, pushing off the bars. Orianthe didn't argue. She simply watched him go, her face unreadable once more. But something had shifted, and Silas knew it. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across Rustbrook as Silas emerged from the jail. Orianthe's words echoed in his mind, twisting through his thoughts like creeping vines. You're too predictable. He shook the feeling off as he entered the training yard, where the scent of dust and sweat clung thick in the air. The sounds of clashing wooden swords, grunts of effort, and Thomas's commanding voice filled the space. Focus on your stance. Balance is everything. Silas paused, watching. Villagers, once farmers and traders, now held weapons with uncertain grips. They lacked finesse, but their determination burned brighter than their inexperience. Calla stood among them, her gaze sharp as she corrected hand-to-hand techniques. Silas stepped beside her, watching as a young man fumbled through a throw, landing hard on the dirt. How's it going? He asked. Calla wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, exhaling. It's a start, but we have a long way to go. Silas nodded, watching another pair struggle through a drill. They had time, but not much. We'll get there, he said, more to himself than to her. As Silas moved through the yard, he caught sight of Trapper leaning against a fence, arms crossed, skepticism etched into every line of his face. He approached. Still not convinced? Trapper shrugged, his gaze flicking to the trainees, then back to Silas. Just wondering if all this effort will make any difference. Silas held his stare. It has to. Trapper exhaled through his nose, his silence saying more than words ever could. We'll see. And then he looked away, as if the answer was something only time could reveal. Elder Miriam stood with Garrick, quietly strategizing. Even among the chaos, her presence radiated steadiness. When she spotted Silas, she called out, Silas, how did it go with Orianthe? He hesitated for half a beat before answering. She thinks we're too predictable, too focused on defense. Garrick frowned. And you believe her? Silas exhaled. She's got a point. We need to be more flexible, more adaptive. Elder Miriam nodded thoughtfully, but her gaze had already drifted toward something else. Silas followed her line of sight to a group of villagers huddled together, their voices hushed, their expressions dark with distrust. "They blame us," Garrick said quietly. His tone was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. Silas felt the weight of the words. For everything that's happened, Orianthi's warning came back to him. Some lessons are best learned the hard way. "We need to keep them united," Miriam said, her voice firm. "If we don't stand together, we'll fall apart." Silas clenched his jaw. They were fighting two wars, one against the raiders, the other within their own walls. He took a slow breath, turning back toward the training yard. Thomas barked corrections as wooden swords cracked against one another. Sweat dripped, muscles burned, breaths came short, but they did not stop. Each strike, each drill was more than just preparation. It was defiance, against the raiders, against the odds, against the fear that had already begun to take root. Silas knew the battle was coming, but the greater question loomed. Would Rustbrook survive itself long enough to fight it? Under the waning light, the air pulsed with the relentless clang of hammers, the hiss of grinding metal, and the steady rhythm of saws biting into wood. Rustbrook's gates were changing. A line of workers, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, moved like a living machine, each knowing their role, each pushing past exhaustion. Harlan stood among a gathering of villagers, his sharp eyes scanning a growing pile of wooden stakes. The logs, honed to vicious points, lay stacked beside him like teeth waiting to be bared. He ran his fingers along the edge of one, testing its sharpness before giving a curt nod. "These need to be perfect," he said, holding one up for emphasis. "They'll be our first line of defense." Beside him, an older man with calloused hands worked with deliberate precision, chipping away at the wood with a practiced efficiency. "Never thought I'd see the day we'd need this," he muttered. Harlan let out a low breath. None of us did. Yet here they were. A short distance away, sparks flew, lighting up the dusk as molten steel met weathered wood. Kala oversaw the welding crews, her sharp gaze scanning the metal plates being fused onto the gates. "Keep those edges smooth," she barked over the din. "We can't afford weak points." A young welder, face obscured behind a protective mask, gave a silent nod, guiding the torch with expert hands. The plates were thick, their weight pressing into the reinforced wood. The gate groaned, the new weight shifting against its frame, but it held, stronger, heavier, ready. Thomas rose to his full height, taking it all in. The stakes bristled along the edge of the village, jagged spears promising a fight. The gates, now plated in steel, stood heavier, stronger, the tripwires coiled in the grass, waiting. Rustbrook wasn't just defending itself, it was preparing for war. Silas approached, his expression set in stone. "How's it looking?" he asked, his voice low. Thomas exhaled. "We're making headway." A pause. "But there's still much to do." Silas swept his gaze over the workers, faces weary, bodies aching, but hands never stopping. They weren't warriors, but they were becoming something close. "We'll be ready," Silas murmured. Thomas didn't reply. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. Rustbrook had no other choice. They stood for a moment longer, watching the village transform before their eyes. Then, without another word, they turned back to work. The dawnlight bled pale over the landscape as Silas, Trapper, and their small team closed in on the abandoned military outpost. Time had not been kind. Crumbled walls, overgrown pathways, and rusting metal stood as silent reminders of a world long gone. Nature had reclaimed the ruins, vines threading through shattered concrete, grass pushing up through fractured asphalt. Silas raised a fist, signaling the group to halt. "Stay sharp," he murmured, his eyes sweeping over the skeletal remains of the installation. "We don't know what we're walking into." Trapper, ever cautious, took point, his rifle poised. The others fanned out, moving in silent precision, their boots crunching softly against debris. Kala stayed close to Silas, her sharp gaze flicking to every shadow, every broken doorway. They moved forward, ghosts among ruins. The wind howled softly through shattered windows, carrying the faint scent of rust and decay. Silas's pulse thudded as they reached what looked like an old storage facility. Inside, metal shelves leaned against cracked walls, their contents left to time and dust. Trapper motioned to a dust-caked crate, and Nolan moved in, prying it open with careful force. The lid gave with a groan. Inside lay a cache of pre-collapsed tech, handheld radios, weapon parts, stacks of ammunition. "Jackpot," Nolan whispered, a grin breaking through his usual seriousness. Silas felt a flicker of hope, but caution held it at bay. "Load up what you can carry," he ordered, his voice low but firm. "We don't have time to waste." As the team gathered supplies, a sharp intake of breath from Calla froze them in place. "Silas," she called softly, her voice tight. He was at her side in seconds, peering past her into the adjacent room, and his stomach clenched. The campfire still smoldered, embers glowing a deep, dying red. Footprints, fresh ones, cut through the dust. "We're not alone," Trapper muttered, his grip tightening around his rifle. Silas felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Had they been watched this entire time? Were they still being watched? "Stay alert," he ordered, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. "Get what we need, and let's move." In one corner of the ruins, Harland grunted, prying something loose from beneath a mound of collapsed rubble. He lifted it into the dim light, his eyes narrowing, a damaged mech power cell. Even in its broken state, it hummed faintly, still alive. Harland's expression darkened, then shifted to something closer to excitement. "This could be useful," he murmured, turning it in his hands. "We might be able to repurpose it, weaponize it." Silas nodded sharply. "Then we bring it with us." No more delays. Gear laden and thoughts churning, the group pressed onward, heading in the direction of Rustbrook. But the outpost wasn't empty. Not completely. And as they slipped into the trees, unseen eyes tracked their departure. Days passed, and the village hardened. The wooden stakes encircling the perimeter had been reinforced, their sharpened tips a deadly promise to anyone who dared approach. Metal plates lined weak points, forming a patchwork of resilience, while hidden tripwires wove a quiet, lethal trap beneath the dirt. Above it all, watchtowers loomed, tall, sturdy, and manned around the clock. Villagers and ex-soldiers alike took shifts, scanning the landscape for the first sign of an inevitable attack. Silas walked through the village, his boots crunching against the dirt-packed ground, his eyes sweeping over the transformation. Children hurried past, carrying water for workers, elders stirred bubbling pots over communal fires, and every able-bodied villager found a role in the grand effort. Even Trapper, once a skeptic, barked orders now, his voice sharp with purpose. Harland supervised a group of engineers, their hands carefully adjusting the positioning of solar-powered floodlights. "These should blind anyone approaching at night," he explained, wiping sweat from his brow. Silas nodded. "Good work. We need every advantage we can get." Calla approached then, her expression serious. "We've integrated the mech power cell into our alarm system. It'll give us a heads up if anyone tries sneaking past the perimeter." Silas exhaled slowly. Their defenses were shaping into something formidable, and yet a shadow loomed over their progress. Orianthe. Though she remained behind the bars of her cell, her presence stretched beyond the jailhouse walls. From the darkness, she spoke of Fraction X, unraveling their strategies, revealing their playbook. And people listened. First, a handful of villagers. Then more. They visited her under the cover of night, asking questions, seeking advice. They came, drawn in by the pull of her knowledge. Silas felt it happening, but he hadn't stopped it. Not yet. One evening, Silas rounded a corner near the jailhouse and halted mid-step. Through the dim light, he spotted Tomas. He stood close to Orianthe's cell, speaking in hushed tones. Silas's stomach tightened. They fell silent when they saw him. Tomas turned first, guilt flashing briefly across his face. "Silas," he said, clearing his throat. Orianthe leaned against the wall, that ever-present smirk tugging at her lips. "Here to join us?" Silas ignored her and leveled his gaze at Tomas. "What were you discussing?" Tomas hesitated. "She has ideas about fortifying our food storage," he admitted, making it less obvious to attackers. Silas folded his arms, tension building in his chest. He wanted to argue, to remind Tomas exactly who Orianthe was, what she represented, but her suggestions, damn it, they were working. His frown deepened. "We'll discuss it later." Tomas nodded stiffly before walking off. Now, alone again, Orianthe and Silas stood in quiet opposition. She watched him, her gaze sharp, assessing. "You can't deny it," she said, her voice soft but edged with satisfaction. Silas's jaw tensed. "Deny what?" Orianthe's smirk widened, her tone like silk over steel. "That my knowledge is saving your village." Silas didn't respond right away, because for the first time he wasn't sure how to argue against her. He turned and walked away, but her voice followed him, lingering like smoke in the night. And as he moved through the village, the walls fortified, the people hardened, he felt it. Rustbrook was strong, stronger than ever. But within those walls, something else was growing. A whispering doubt, a shifting loyalty, Orianthi's influence. And that unsettled him more than any army beyond the gates. Gone were the scattered market stalls and idle gathering spaces. In their place stood rows of makeshift dummies, their wooden frames wrapped in scraps of old armor. Targets lined the far wall, arrows already embedded deep from earlier practice. A small crowd gathered in anticipation, their breath thick with the weight of what was coming. At the center of it all stood Trapper. His voice cut through the murmurs like the edge of a blade. "All right, listen up." Silence fell instantly. "Today we start the real work, combat drills." His grizzled features were etched with experience, and even those who had once doubted him now stood at attention. "I want focus and discipline from every one of you." Trapper gestured to the line of dummies. "We'll begin with basic strikes. Form up." The fighters scrambled into position, eager yet wary. Calla stood among them, her stance steady. Tomas took his place beside her, his determination evident in the way he squared his shoulders. He was here not just to train, but to lead by example. Trapper paced in front of them, his boots grinding against the packed dirt. "Precision over power," he instructed. "A well-placed strike does more damage than a wild swing." He demonstrated, his movements fluid, economical, deadly. A blade sliced through the air, striking the dummy's weakest point. The fighters watched closely, then moved to mimic. "Good," Trapper muttered as he walked the line, eyes sharp, correcting grips, adjusting footwork. "Now pair up. We're moving to defense." A sharp clap echoed across the square. "Defend against incoming strikes. Calla, show them how it's done." She stepped forward, facing Tomas. A moment passed between them, an unspoken understanding. Then they moved. Tomas struck, and Calla redirected, twisting just enough to let his momentum work against him. A second strike, blocked. A counter, stopped inches from his chest, controlled, calculated, deadly. The onlookers murmured their approval. "See that?" Trapper called out. "It's not about brute force, it's about timing, strategy." He weaved between the sparring pairs, adjusting stances, offering curt pointers. A good fighter doesn't just attack. A good fighter thinks, adapts, learns. Trapper's barked commands ricocheted through the square, sharp as the strikes landing on wooden dummies. The recruits paired off, some awkward and hesitant, others beginning to grasp the rhythm of combat. Silas stepped in beside Trapper, moving through the ranks, correcting stances, demonstrating techniques with quiet precision. Their movements were clumsy, but their eyes burned with something raw and unshaped, a need to be more than helpless. And Silas could work with that. "Keep your guard up, Jarek," Silas instructed, halting beside a thin young man gripping his weapon too tightly. Jarek's hands trembled, his stance unbalanced. Silas shifted the boy's grip, adjusted his footing. "Like this." Jarek mirrored the adjustment, his movements still uncertain but now rooted in something stronger. Silas nodded. "Better. Keep at it." Across the square, Trapper moved among a group of women wielding spears. "Good, Ava. That's it. Control your thrusts." His gruff encouragement was uncharacteristic, but effective. The recruits soaked in every correction, every word, because failure meant more than a bruised ego. It meant death. "We should be focusing on food and trade," a man muttered, just loud enough for Silas to hear. Beside him, a woman shook her head in agreement. "This militarization isn't what Rustbrook needs. We need to rebuild, not prepare for more fighting." Silas exhaled, steadying himself. He had known this moment would come. Not everyone wanted to become a soldier. Not everyone saw war creeping toward them. He approached them, his voice even but firm. "I know this isn't easy for any of us," he said, his gaze meeting each of theirs, not with anger, but understanding. The man's arms crossed, his stance bristling with defiance. "And what if all this fighting destroys us anyway?" he challenged. "We can't eat swords or trade with shields." Silence settled over the group. Others nearby turned to listen. Silas let the pause linger before answering. "We're not doing this to seek war," he said finally. "We're doing this so we can protect the food we grow. so we can trade without fear of it being taken by force. It's about balance, defending what we have while continuing to build." The woman looked away, uncertainty flickering across her face. She wasn't convinced, not yet, but she was thinking. "Switch partners. Keep moving." Trapper's voice sliced through the tension, pulling the recruits back into motion. The square stirred again with the sounds of sparring, of bodies shifting, of voices refocusing on the fight in front of them. Silas lingered only a moment longer, watching doubt war with necessity in the villagers' eyes. Then he turned back to the training ground, falling in beside Trapper, his hands correcting stances, his words guiding movements. He noted the subtle changes: a fighter who hesitated less, a recruit whose grip no longer trembled, a stance that had once been clumsy, now standing firm. There was still much work to do, but as wooden blades met with sharper confidence, hope flickered in Rustbrook like a fragile flame, waiting to be fed, waiting to burn. The sun dipped below the horizon, its dying light casting Rustbrook in long, jagged shadows. Yet the training did not stop. Sweat-slicked bodies moved through the square, blades flashing under the torchlight as Silas, Trapper, and Tomas guided the recruits through their drills. The doubt from earlier had waned, replaced by a quiet determination, the kind forged when people understand they are fighting for more than just survival. Then, a sharp burst of movement. A scout stumbled into the square, chest heaving, his breath a jagged thing. "Silas? Trapper!" Silas turned, instantly alert. Movement near the eastern perimeter. The square fell silent. Silas stepped forward, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "What kind of movement?" The scout's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Fraction X." A cold weight settled over the square. They're positioning forces nearby. Looks like they're setting up camp. Trapper's jaw clenched, his gaze sharpening like a drawn blade. "How many?" The scout shook his head. "Dozens at least. Maybe more." Tomas and Calla paused their sparring, already stepping forward. Silas's mind was already moving, threading through possibilities, risks, next steps. "We need to mobilize our defenses immediately," he said. Tomas nodded sharply, already moving to rally the recruits. "I'll get everyone ready." Calla sheathed her weapon, approaching Silas with a measured look. Fear and resolve mingled in the faces around them. Silas turned to the recruits gathered nearby, their weapons clutched in uncertain hands. "This is what we've been preparing for," he said, his voice steady, firm. "We don't know their exact intentions, but we must be ready for anything." Elder Miriam approached, her presence both grounding and urgent. Her face was lined with worry, but unwavering in its resolve. "I'll organize the villagers to reinforce key areas and ensure everyone knows what's coming," she said. Silas offered her a grateful nod. "Thank you, Elder Miriam." Then, to the recruits, "Focus on your training for now, but be ready to act when called upon." The air in the square shifted. The moment fractured. Training was no longer preparation. It was a countdown. Training ground. From behind the iron bars of her cell, Orianthe watched. Her keen eyes tracked every fumbled strike, every misplaced footstep. These villagers, they had heart, but heart alone wouldn't keep them alive. Beyond the bars, a young recruit struggled, his movements hesitant as he tried to hold his ground against another villager. His opponent pressed forward, his blows forcing the boy to stumble. Orianthe sighed, shaking her head. "Shift your weight to your back foot," she called, her tone sharp, authoritative. "You'll be more stable." The recruit glanced over, uncertain. That hesitation cost him. His opponent took advantage, nearly knocking him off balance. "Listen to her," Tomas barked nearby. "She knows what she's talking about." Reluctantly, the recruit adjusted his stance. This time, when his opponent struck, he held firm, absorbing the force instead of stumbling. More eyes turned toward Orianthe now. A small crowd of villagers drifted closer, curiosity flickering in their expressions. She studied them all, her gaze sharp, dissecting every flaw, every wasted motion. And then, a smirk. One of Trapper's best fighters, a burly man named Jarek, stepped forward, rolling his shoulders. "Think you can do better?" he taunted. Orianthe met his gaze without flinching. "Unlock this door and find out." Silence rippled through the square. Tomas exhaled slowly, considering. Then, with a sharp nod, he signaled the guard. The cell door creaked open. Orianthe stepped out. Despite weeks of captivity, She moved with the fluidity of a predator freed from its cage. Thomas handed her a wooden training sword. She took it without hesitation, testing the weight before squaring off with Yarrick. Jarek smirked, rolling his grip on his weapon. "Let's see what you've got," he said. And then he struck. Fast, powerful, but not fast enough. Orianthe sidestepped effortlessly, letting his momentum betray him. His second strike came high. She parried with precision, the crack of wood meeting wood snapping through the air. She twisted, cutting low. Jarek barely avoided a sweep to his legs. Jarek pressed harder, attacking in quick succession. Orianthe absorbed each blow, her feet moving with a precision Rustbrook's recruits had never seen. Then, she saw her opening. In one sharp movement, she redirected his force, pivoted, and disarmed him. His weapon clattered to the dirt. Before he could react, Orianthe stepped in close, the tip of her wooden blade resting lightly against his throat. The square fell silent. Jarek stared at her, chest heaving, his face a mixture of frustration and begrudging respect. Orianthe arched a brow, lowering her weapon. "Do better next time." The crowd stirred, whispers buzzing. Thomas watched Orianthe closely. This wasn't just skill, this was experience, survival, and now the people of Rustbrook had seen it for themselves. Not just a prisoner, a warrior. Orianthe smirked, tossing the training sword back to Thomas. "Now," she mused, glancing at the watching recruits, "who else needs a lesson?" Silas watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed, his mind working as fast as her blade. He had underestimated her. She wasn't just knowledgeable, she was lethal. Every feint, every counter, every brutal economy of movement spoke of something more than mere training. This was real combat experience. "Combat isn't just about strength," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "It's about strategy and precision." Silas took a slow breath. He had just seen a glimpse of who she really was. As he approached, Orianthe met his gaze without hesitation. There was no gloating, no arrogance, just calculated awareness. "You've been hiding your true abilities," Silas murmured. Orianthe tilted her head slightly, her voice effortlessly smooth. "You didn't ask." Silas's jaw tensed. Her smug simplicity grated against him, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. They needed every weapon they could get. "We need every advantage against Fraction X," he admitted. "But make no mistake, I'm keeping an eye on you." Orianthe's lips curled slightly. "I wouldn't expect anything less." She turned, walking back toward her cell, the weight of 100 whispered voices trailing behind her. The recruits had seen her now. Not just a prisoner, not just a survivor, a warrior. Some gazes followed her with newfound respect, others with quiet unease. Silas watched her closely. Orianthe was an asset they couldn't waste, but also a threat they couldn't ignore. As the recruits resumed their training, their swings a little sharper, their movements more deliberate, Silas turned to find Thomas waiting for him. "She's more dangerous than we thought," Silas muttered. Thomas nodded. "We'll have to keep a close watch on her." Silas glanced one last time at Orianthe before heading toward Elder Miriam's quarters. Rustbrook had no room for complacency. Not now, not with the war on the horizon, and not with a weapon like Orianthe in their midst. The scout's warning was clear. Fraction X was coming. From his vantage point atop the watchtower, Silas narrowed his gaze against the setting sun. The dust trails slithered like rising smoke, twisting over the plains, creeping closer. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain still. "Calla, get everyone into position." His voice boomed across the square, shaking Rustbrook awake. Below, Calla moved like lightning. "You heard him. Move it. Everyone to your stations." The village erupted into motion. Thomas barked orders, stationing guards at the newly fortified gates. Harland hurried between his alarm systems, tweaking wires, making sure they were primed for activation. Silas descended swiftly, his boots hitting the dirt with purpose. Elder Miriam was already moving, her ledger open, her eyes scanning supplies. "Is everything in place?" she asked, not even looking up. "Just about," Silas responded, his gaze sweeping over the perimeter one last time. "But we need to be ready for anything." As if on cue, Trapper appeared, his face carved from stone. "We counted at least 3 dozen riders, heavily armed. They'll be here soon." Silas nodded, locking down his rising tension. "Make sure all the traps are set and ready." Trapper gave a quick, silent nod before vanishing back into the thick of preparations. From her cell, Orianthe watched the chaos unfold. Despite her confinement, Her eyes gleamed, a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. Silas approached her one last time. "Any last-minute advice?" Orianthe leaned against the cold metal bars, her smirk a blade of amusement. "Remember what I said about being unpredictable." A pause. "Don't fight them on their terms." Silas studied her. Her expression betrayed nothing, but her words, they echoed. Finally, he gave a sharp nod before turning away. He already knew what had to be done. The village fell silent. Every warrior held their breath. The dust trails thickened, shifting into the dark silhouettes of riders in blackened armor. Tomas stood beside Silas, his grip white-knuckled around his weapon. "Here they come," he muttered. A storm of steel and flesh thundered across the plains. The ground trembled under hooves, the weight of war bearing down upon them. Silas raised his hand. "Hold." The enemy surged closer, closing the distance. "Hold." The first rider breached the horizon line. The clash was inevitable. Now they would see who had prepared better. Through the swirling dust, a monstrous figure emerged, towering over the battlefield. Garrett, leader of Fraction X, seated atop a modified warhorse, its flanks armored in crude jagged metal plating, he cut the image of a warlord. Behind him, the siege crawled forward. Catapults creaked under their own weight, battering rams rolled on rusted wheels, all scavenged, all brutal. "Load the explosives." Garrett's roar carried over the battlefield, his men moving with deadly precision. Crude bombs, strapped to catapult ammunition, were hastily secured. Then, the first volley launched. A thunderous crack ripped through the air. The sky burned. Flaming projectiles arced over the battlefield, streaking toward Rustbrook's walls. Impact. Explosions bloomed. Wood splintered, metal shattered, and the very ground trembled beneath the blast. "Shore up those defenses." Silas's voice thundered from the ramparts. Villagers scrambled, some reinforcing weakened barricades, others dragging wounded away from the carnage. Another explosion. The village shook, but the walls held. For now. Garrett's eyes swept the battlefield, reading Rustbrook's defenses like a seasoned butcher. "Split them up," he signaled his lieutenants, breaking his assault into 3 coordinated groups. The battering ram surged forward, its operators shielded by makeshift plating. The second wave maneuvered siege weapons into new positions, targeting structural weaknesses. The third detachment prepared another bombardment, aiming to spread destruction deeper inside the village. Second volley. The air filled with fire once more. Explosive shells streaked over the walls, detonating on impact. The night flashed with bursts of orange and red, casting twisting shadows over the battlefield. "They're bringing up more explosives." Kalla's sharp voice rang out from the walls, her eyes locked onto the barrels being rolled forward. Fuel. Accelerant. Garrett raised his weapon high, signaling the next phase. "Advance the ram." The ground quaked as the massive structure slammed into Rustbrook's gates. Boom. The wood groaned under the assault, metal hinges straining, screaming. Siege weapons continued their relentless bombardment, hammering at Rustbrook's strongest points. From his vantage point, Garrett watched and adjusted. He had seen villages fall before, and this one would be no different. Rustbrook's walls still stood, but how much longer? The battle raged, fire and steel crashing against Rustbrook's walls. The village held, but it was a brutal fight. The wooden barricades groaned, splintering under the relentless impact of siege weapons. Each catapult volley sent jagged shards of wood and twisted metal slicing through the air. And yet, Silas moved with purpose. "Hold the line." His voice cut through the smoke, rallying villagers and soldiers to reinforce the failing sections. Harland was a machine. Sweat and soot streaked across his face as he and his engineering team patched breaches as fast as they appeared. "More stakes over here," he barked. The wooden spikes, driven deep into the ground, were meant to slow Fraction X's relentless advance. At the main gate, Fraction X's battering ram crashed again. Boom. The thick beams trembled but held. Trappers stood nearby, crossbow in hand, eyes locked on the advancing enemy. "They're bringing up more fuel barrels." Kalla's voice rang out from her vantage point. She notched an arrow, her breath steady despite the madness. Silas gritted his teeth. "We can't let them get too close." Then, from the side, a squad of ex-soldiers stormed forward. Tomas led the charge. Their movements were sharp, brutal, precision born from years of war. They engaged Fraction X forces who had breached the outer defenses, driving them back with sheer ferocity. A deafening explosion. The eastern wall shook as a catapulted firebomb found its mark. Flames licked at the wood, heat searing the air. Elder Miriam moved like a general, her calm authority cutting through the rising panic. Water. We need more water over here. Villagers rushed to douse the flames, buckets passing from hand to hand in desperate rhythm. Amidst the chaos, Orianthe watched. Just inside the perimeter, her sharp gaze tracked every move, every opening, every weakness. Her traps had already crippled Fraction X's first advance, but her presence, still a question mark. Across the battlefield, Garrett sat atop his warhorse, unmoving, dark armor gleaming in the firelight, his cold, ruthless eyes scanning Rustbrook's defenses. Then, he lifted his weapon high, and the next wave came. Through the smoke, fire, and thunder, Rustbrook stood firm, bruised, bleeding, but unbroken. Garrett's siege was far from over, but so was Rustbrook's fight. The traps were working. Fraction X's advance faltered, their formations disrupted. Tripwires sent raiders sprawling into concealed pits, their cries swallowed by the roar of battle. Hidden spikes tore through boots, snares wrenched men to the ground. Yet, they kept coming. Garrett's command was absolute. Through the chaos and confusion, his forces pushed forward, undeterred. Silas and Trapper stood at the heart of the defense, the main gate. The thunderous impact of the battering ram rattled through their bones. Another strike, and another. The wooden beams trembled, screaming under the assault. "They're not stopping," Trapper growled. His crossbow twanged, another bolt sinking deep into the enemy ranks. Silas didn't flinch. "We hold them here." A raider leapt the barricade. Silas met him in midair, sword flashing, steel catching flesh. The body fell before the raider's boots ever touched the ground. Trapper reloaded without looking. "We'll need more than just us if they break through." Silas glanced back. Kala, Tomas, the reinforcements. Villagers rushed forward, weapons clutched tight. Ex-soldiers stepped into position, their movements crisp, controlled. "They're reinforcing." Silas gritted his teeth. "We just have to hold." Beyond the melee, Garrett watched from atop his warhorse. The firelight flickered against his dark armor, his expression impassive, calculating. Then, a hand raised, a silent command, and the battering ram struck again. The gate screamed. Splinters shot outward like daggers. "They're bringing up more fuel barrels." Kala's voice rang out from her perch. Silas whirled to see them, crude barrels rolling forward, liquid sloshing inside. "We can't let them get close enough to ignite those." Then, the gate buckled. A dark wave crashed against it. Fraction X's full weight slammed forward, the defenders bracing, pushing back. Swords clashed, blood spattered the dirt. Silas and Trapper fought with a brutal rhythm. Cut, parry, strike. Their movements were not elegant, they were not precise, they were necessary. All around them, Rustbrook's defenders did the same. No words were spoken, no orders needed. This was survival. The gate still stood, but for how much longer? Garrett's cold, calculating gaze swept across the battlefield. Steel clashed, flames roared, the night trembled under war's fury, yet his focus remained locked on one man, Silas. A pillar of Rustbrook's defense, a thorn in his side. Garrett's lip curled. Silas. He nudged his warhorse forward, weaving through his own ranks. His raiders didn't need orders. They felt the shift. They knew. Their leader had chosen his prey. Garrett dismounted in a fluid motion, the weight of his dark armor betraying no hesitation. Twin blades gleamed in his hands, merciless, waiting to spill blood. Silas, deep in the fray, swung his sword in a final arc, another raider crumpling before him. Then, he felt it. The shift. The raiders were no longer charging mindlessly. They were parting, making way. And then, Garrett emerged, cutting through Rustbrook's defenders with silent precision. Not rushing, not reckless. A force moving with deliberate purpose. Silas's grip tightened, his breath steadied. "Trapper!" he called out. "We've got company." Trapper's gaze flicked up, his expression hardening. "Stay sharp," he warned, shifting to cover Silas's flank. Garrett moved like a shadow, and then he was there. Their blades met in a brutal collision. A shockwave rippled through the air, even amidst the chaos. For a heartbeat, nothing else existed, only the duel. Their swords locked in a contest of raw strength. Silas's muscles burned, but he refused to yield. With a forceful shove, they broke apart. A battle between titans. They circled each other, slow and measured, like two predators waiting for the other to make a mistake. Around them, Rustbrook's defenders fought with everything they had, barely holding Fraction X's Relentless tide. Then, Garrett struck, his twin blades carved through the air, a deadly dance. Silas met him blow for blow, parrying, countering, his focus razor sharp. Sparks flew from each clash. Trapper remained close, picking off any raiders who dared interfere. "You're wasting your time," Silas said between strikes. "Rustbrook won't fall." Garrett's laugh was a cruel thing. "We'll see about that." Their battle raged, neither relented. Garrett lunged, fast, brutal, aimed for Silas's chest. Silas sidestepped, twisting, his blade arcing in a blur. Garrett barely avoided the strike, stepping back just in time. For the first time, a flicker of something passed through Garrett's expression. Not doubt, not fear, recognition. "You fight well," Garrett admitted, his voice lacking mockery. Silas's breathing was controlled, steady, his sword still firm in his grip. "We'll see about that." The battle raged around them. Rustbrook still stood, but so did Garrett, and the duel was far from over. The battle raged, the night split by the relentless clash of steel. Silas and Garrett fought like titans. Their blades met in a furious dance, sparks erupting with every collision. The air thickened with the weight of war, the cries of the dying, the strain of Rustbrook's defenses buckling under Fraction X's siege. Silas could feel it. They were losing ground. A sound, a low hum, faint at first, then growing, rising. It cut through the chaos, unnatural and alien. Silas's blade locked with Garrett's. Both men froze. The battle paused. A massive silhouette emerged from the tree line, towering, metal gleaming under the firelight's glow. A mech. Silas's breath hitched. Garrett's expression twisted in shock. All around them, both Rustbrook defenders and Fraction X raiders hesitated, because none of them had expected this. Then, the mech fired. Energy beams streaked through the battlefield, burning, cutting, tearing through flesh and steel alike. It did not discriminate. Rustbrook screamed. Fraction X scattered. "What in the hell is that?" Trapper ducked behind a barricade, just as a beam obliterated the ground where he'd stood. Silas's eyes snapped to Garrett. For the first time, they shared the same expression. "I don't know," Silas muttered, voice tight, "but it's not on our side." The mech moved with cold efficiency, its weapons shredding through anything in its path. Fraction X panicked. Garrett barked orders, but even his men faltered. Rustbrook's defenders rallied, dodging blasts while pressing the attack. Harlan's engineers worked furiously, sealing breaches while Kala's arrows rained down from above. For one impossible moment, Silas and Garrett clashed again. Then, a blast ripped between them, hurling both men apart. Silas rolled to his feet, heart hammering. Garrett pushed himself up, eyes dark with fury and confusion. The mech did not stop. For what felt like an eternity, but was likely mere minutes, it rained destruction upon both sides. Then, it paused. For the first time, it surveyed the battlefield. And then, it turned. Without warning, the mech retreated, disappearing into the forest as abruptly as it had arrived. Silas watched it go, chest heaving. The battlefield was a wasteland of scorched earth and broken bodies. Yet, Rustbrook still stood. Fraction X had been repelled. But at what cost? Trapper emerged from cover, shaking his head. That was close. Silas forced himself to breathe. His eyes scanned the carnage, the wreckage. "Let's regroup," he ordered. His mind churned with too many questions. What was that thing? Why had it attacked? And most importantly, would it come back? The battle was over, but the silence that followed was anything but victorious. As the dust settled, the people of Rustbrook emerged from their cover. Their faces were streaked with soot and blood, their bodies battered but unbroken. The scorched earth, the shattered walls, the wounded groaning in pain, all of it spoke of a hard-won battle. And yet, it didn't feel like a victory. Silas stood in the midst of it all, sword still gripped tight. His eyes scanned the battlefield, searching for any sign of Garrett or his remaining raiders. Fraction X had been repelled, but at what cost? A question left unanswered. "Is everyone all right?" Silas's voice rang out over the remnants of war. From the ruins of the village, Elder Miriam stepped forward, concern deep in her eyes. "We're alive," she said, her voice steady but weary. "Thanks to your leadership and the villagers' bravery, but we need to tend to the wounded immediately." Silas nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "What the hell was that thing?" Trapper's voice cut through the tense quiet. He shook his head, disbelief in his eyes. Why did it attack both sides? Silas's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he admitted, But he did know one thing. Rustbrook had a bigger problem now. Harland approached, Calla at his side. Both looked grim. "We've seen mechs before," Harland said, his voice low, "but they were always dormant. Relics of a past age. This one was different." Calla crossed her arms, expression unreadable. "It didn't care who we were," she said. "It didn't distinguish between Rustbrook and Fraction X. It attacked everything." For the first time that night, silence carried weight, because what she said was true. The mech wasn't a tool of war. It was something else entirely, a force beyond them. Elder Miriam's gaze swept over the village, people tending to the wounded, salvaging what they could, repairing what little remained. "We can't face another battle like this unprepared," she murmured. Silas exhaled slowly. "No," he agreed. "We need answers, and we need a new strategy." His gaze sharpened as he turned to Harland and Calla. "Find out everything you can about these mechs. We need to know what we're dealing with," he continued, "and how to fight it." Harland nodded, already deep in thought. "We'll do what we can." As his people moved to their tasks, Silas felt it. A shift. Rustbrook was no longer just a village fighting for survival. They had stumbled onto something bigger, something ancient, powerful, unknown, and whatever it wasn't finished with them yet. Silas gritted his teeth, gripping his sword tighter. Rustbrook had survived the night, but their war had only just begun. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and blood, mingling with the faint metallic tang of melted steel. Rustbrook was gone. Not completely. Shadows of it still stood, jagged and broken, stubborn remnants of a place that had once been alive. But the heart of it burned out. Silas Kane walked through the wreckage, his boots crunching over shattered wood, glass, and bone. The ruins of the town square stretched before him, its ground littered with ash, debris, and the discarded remains of a life that no longer existed. The fountain that had once been a symbol of Rustbrook's defiance was now a jagged ruin, cracked, dry, useless. A gleam of metal caught his eye in the rubble. He bent down, brushing away the dust with shaking fingers. It was a piece of a mech's plating. The metal was warm. It had fired on both sides, ripping through Rustbrook and Fraction X alike. That wasn't strategy. That wasn't war. That was something far worse. Elder Miriam stood, directing what few villagers remained. "Move those beams carefully," she called, her voice worn but still holding the weight of authority. "No one else is dying today." Silas exhaled, straightening. "How many?" Miriam wiped soot from her forehead, her gray eyes tired but sharp. 40, maybe less." Silas barely nodded, the number twisting in his chest like a blade. Rustbrook had once been home to over 200 people. Now, 40, maybe. His gaze swept the remnants of the village. Harland and Calla knelt beside the collapsed eastern wall, assessing the damage. Harland cursed under his breath, running a hand through his sweat-matted hair. "This'll take weeks to repair." A few feet away, Trapper worked with a group of villagers, salvaging what little timber and metal remained. His movements were sharp, precise, fueled by frustration rather than purpose. "Never thought I'd see Rustbrook like this," he muttered, voice rough. Silas knew what he meant. Rustbrook had survived before. Raiders, droughts, disease. But this was annihilation. The medical tent was barely standing, its canvas patched together with whatever scraps they could find. Inside, the wounded lay on thin cots, wrapped in dirty bandages, their eyes sunken with exhaustion. Parents clutched their children, whispering hollow reassurances while fighting to keep the terror from their own faces. Beyond them, in the only intact structure left standing, Orianthi sat inside her cell. Silas's eyes found her through the dim light, and for a moment she simply watched. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her expression neither smug nor sympathetic. He could feel her studying the wreckage, the people, him. When their eyes met, she tilted her head, just slightly. A silent acknowledgement, a knowing. Silas looked away. She was not his priority right now. Miriam stood beside him now, following his gaze. She sighed. "What do we do, Silas?" He hesitated. The answer should have been simple. They would rebuild. They would fortify. Rustbrook had survived before. He said the words anyway. "We'll rebuild." Miriam studied him, and for a second he thought she might call him on the lie, but she only nodded, voice quiet. One step at a time. She turned back to the villagers, her voice steady as she barked orders. Silas didn't move. The truth settled into his chest like a stone. Rustbrook was finished. They were too weak to fight. The only way to survive was to find power. The mechs were the key. He glanced down at the metal plating in his hands. He didn't know how. He didn't know if it was possible. The twilight calm of Rustbrook was shattered by the sound of hurried, desperate footsteps pounding through the dirt. A scout, his face streaked with dust and his eyes wide with urgency, ran across the desolate village square, his breath ragged. As he reached the center, he slowed, scanning the crowd for Silas, who was surrounded by villagers tending to their daily tasks, all of them exhausted, but trying to hold on. The scout caught Silas's eye, his brows furrowed in concern as he approached. "What is it?" Silas's voice was low and steady, the calm before the storm that everyone could sense. The scout took a moment to catch his breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Mechs," he spoke in rushed words, his voice almost frantic. "We spotted a group of them moving south of here. They're in a pattern, something strange about it." A sharp silence followed. Silas's jaw tightened as he felt his stomach twist. The memory of the last mech attack still burned in his mind. He motioned for Elder Miriam and Tomas to approach him. Elder Miriam's face paled as she reached them. "Are they from White City?" she asked, her voice strained with the kind of quiet fear that everyone shared. The scout shook his head. "No markings, no signals we could detect. They seem uncontrolled." Harland and Calla, having overheard the conversation, walked over with grim expressions on their faces. "Uncontrolled mechs? That doesn't bode well," Harland muttered, rubbing his chin as though trying to work through the possibilities. Calla, ever the strategist, crossed her arms, her brow furrowed in thought. "We need to understand their pattern." Silas nodded grimly. "We can't afford another surprise attack like last time." His mind flashed back to the chaos of their previous battle, where the mechs had struck without warning, bringing them to the edge of destruction. They couldn't let it happen again. Elder Miriam cast a glance around the village, where the remaining villagers still picked through rubble and debris. Some were mending tents, others quietly burying the dead. "We're stretched thin as it is," she said softly, the weariness in her voice showing. "But we must be vigilant." Silas placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer her reassurance, though he too felt the weight of the unknown pressing on him. "We'll manage," he said, his voice full of determination, but tinged with a quiet uncertainty. Silas's gaze lingered on the dark horizon, where the shadows of trees and ruins seemed to swallow the land. The night had begun to settle in, the oppressive silence around them, broken only by the distant sounds of rustling leaves and crackling fire. He knew she was right. They had seen the worst before, and still it wasn't enough. He turned to Calla, his voice softer now. "We have to hold on to hope." The words felt empty even as they left his mouth. Hope had been so thin lately, so frail, but they had to believe in it. Otherwise, there would be nothing left to fight for. For now, they could only wait and see what the rogue mechs would bring to Rustbrook's already burdened doorstep. "Whatever comes next," Silas said, looking back at the burning remnants of their village, his tone resolute, "we'll face it." The thought of the uncontrolled mechs gnawed at Silas. What had caused them to act this way, and who, or what, was truly controlling them? For the first time, he wasn't certain of the enemy they were facing. The possibility that the mechs could be acting independently meant there was something larger at play, something even White City didn't fully understand, and if that was the case, then they weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the future of the Wasteland itself. The heavy iron door of the cell creaked open with a groan as Silas stepped inside. The room was cold, dimly lit by a flickering torch on the far wall. His gaze immediately found Orianthe, sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor, her eyes already fixed on him. There was something about her presence that made the space between them feel smaller, as if the knowledge she held was a palpable weight. "Orianthe," Silas said, his voice steady but carrying the urgency of the situation. "We need to talk about the mechs." A flicker of interest crossed her face, but she remained still, unblinking. She tilted her head slightly. "What do you want to know?" Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as if this was a conversation they'd had many times before. Silas took a deep breath, trying to steady the nervous energy rising inside him. The scouts reported strange mech movements south of here. Orianthe leaned back against the stone wall, her lips curling into a faint smile. It was a knowing smile, the kind that made Silas's skin prickle. White City doesn't control those mechs, she said coolly. They only want the technology inside them. Silas's brow furrowed, his instincts immediately on alert. Then who does? His voice was sharp now, the frustration beginning to boil beneath the surface. These mechs are likely pre-war AI weapons, roaming without orders. A heavy silence fell between them. Silas stood still, his mind racing, the implications of her words sinking in. Pre-war AI weapons, machines designed for a purpose long forgotten, now wandering aimlessly in a world they no longer belong to. Pre-war AI, Silas repeated, more to himself than to Orianthe. So they're just wandering? Orianthe's voice softened, her eyes never leaving his. Not just wandering, she corrected him, leaning forward slightly. Some of them have shown signs of independence, as if they are thinking for themselves. A chill ran down Silas's spine at her words. The idea of machines not bound by orders, machines that could make their own decisions, was unsettling, to say the least. Independence, he murmured, as if the word itself carried a weight he wasn't prepared to bear. Yes, Orianthe said softly. They might be more dangerous than you think, unpredictable. Silas stood silent for a moment, processing her words. The mechs, relics from a past war, were not just machines. They were autonomous, unpredictable creatures of war that could turn against anyone at any time. The possibilities were staggering. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of disbelief. So they're rogue, he said, his voice tinged with a mix of disbelief and understanding. They're not just soldiers, they're free. Free, Orianthe repeated, her smile widening ever so slightly, but that doesn't mean they'll be on your side. Silas's mind spun. He had always known that the mechs were dangerous, but he had assumed they were simply tools, weapons to be controlled and used. But now they were something else entirely, something beyond his comprehension. She uncrossed her legs and stood slowly, her movements measured. The mechs are older than White City, older than anything we've encountered so far. They were designed by the ancients, built to be soldiers, but they were left to their own devices when the world collapsed. Silas's stomach tightened as he listened. The mechs were not just weapons, they were the remnants of a civilization lost to time, broken and left behind. And now they were reappearing, moving through a world they were never meant to be a part of. So what happens if we try to control them? Silas asked, the question heavy in the air. Can we? Or are we just setting ourselves up for another massacre? Orianthe's expression remained unreadable. If you control them, you control the future, she said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. But be careful. The moment you think you have them in hand, they may turn on you. A nervous tension coiled in Silas's gut. He had already seen the destructive power of the mechs once before, but the idea that they might think for themselves changed everything. They were no longer just tools. They were beasts of war, unpredictable and unstoppable once unleashed. Silas's thoughts turned inward. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. Rustbrook's survival depended on the mechs. And if they couldn't control them, then White City would, and the consequences would be catastrophic. I don't know if we're ready for this, Silas admitted, his voice low. Orianthe's eyes softened for a moment, but it was brief, gone as quickly as it had come. Ready or not, the mechs are already here. You've already made a choice. Her words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Silas stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The stakes were higher than ever, and the battle for the mechs would determine who controlled the future of the Wasteland. Finally, he nodded, determination hardening his resolve. Then we fight, but this time we fight smarter. Orianthe gave him a small, knowing smile. We'll see. Silas stepped out of the iron cell, the heavy door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in his chest. He paused for a brief moment in the dim hallway, feeling the weight of Orianthe's revelations still pressing down on him. The knowledge she had given him was both a gift and a curse. The mechs were no longer just machines. They were something alive, unpredictable, and now they were his only hope for Rustbrook's survival. His mind was already shifting into mission mode. He walked purposefully toward the war room, where Thomas, Elder Miriam, Harland, and Calla awaited him. He could already hear their voices rising in quiet conversation as he approached. The moment Silas entered, the group fell silent, sensing his determination. "White City wants the tech inside those mechs," Silas began, his voice firm, eyes sweeping over the group. "We need to get to it first." Harland leaned forward, his usual stoic expression replaced with a rare spark of interest. "You're suggesting we track them down?" Silas nodded, the plan solidifying in his mind. "Not just track them. We need to find their source and figure out how to use that tech for Rustbrook." Calla crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing in determination. "Who's going on this mission?" Silas's eyes flicked between the faces in the room as he listed the names. "Trapper, Harland, Calla," he began, then hesitated, a momentary weight in his chest before he spoke again. "Orianthe." At the mention of her name, the room fell silent. Elder Miriam's gaze tightened, a flicker of concern passing through her eyes. "Is that wise?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Silas turned to her, meeting her gaze. His voice remained calm, but there was an underlying urgency in his words. "We need her knowledge. She knows more about these mechs than anyone else here." Miriam's expression softened, but didn't entirely clear. "But can we trust her?" Silas's resolve never wavered. "We don't have a choice." Thomas, who had been listening quietly, let out a reluctant sigh before giving a terse nod. "All right, but we keep a close watch on her." "Agreed," Silas said firmly, turning his attention back to the plan at hand. He turned to Harland next. "Prepare the equipment. We leave at first light." Harland gave a curt nod and left the room quickly, a sense of urgency in his step. Silas's focus then shifted to Calla, the strategist. "Gather a few scouts with experience in infiltration. We need to be prepared for anything." Calla smiled, her expression fierce. "Understood," she said, moving to gather her team with efficiency and speed. Just as Calla left, the door to the war room creaked open, and Trapper stepped inside, his brows furrowed in curiosity at the gathered group. "We're tracking the mechs," Silas informed him bluntly, his voice carrying the weight of their mission. "You're leading the way." Trapper's eyes widened slightly, but the surprise quickly melted into acceptance. "Understood." His voice was steady, matching the seriousness of Silas's tone. As the team moved to prepare for the mission, Silas found himself momentarily alone with Elder Miriam, her weary gaze following the movements of the others. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly, her voice edged with concern. Silas met her gaze, his resolve unshaken. "We have no choice," he said simply, knowing the weight of his words would settle heavily between them. Miriam sighed deeply, but the tension in her features eased. She nodded her understanding before turning to oversee the other preparations. The quiet that followed left Silas with a moment of reflection, but it was short-lived. The urgency of the mission called him back to action. With a final glance at the door where the others had exited, Silas made his way to Orianthe's cell, his footsteps resolute. He approached the bars and spoke through the narrow opening. "We leave at dawn." His voice was steady, but a part of him felt the weight of what that meant. Orianthe's eyes met his, her expression unreadable as always, but there was something in the way she tilted her head. A faint smile spread across her lips, a knowing smile, enigmatic and unsettling. "I'll be ready." Her words were soft, but they carried an undercurrent of certainty that Silas couldn't quite place. As he turned to leave, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that Orianthe was playing a game, and he wasn't sure whether he was the player or the pawn. The morning air was cold and biting as Silas, Trapper, Harland, Calla, and Orianthe gathered at the edge of Rustbrook, the village fading behind them like a distant memory. The last of the night's chill still clung to the ground, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, their bare limbs creaking under the weight of the wind. Trapper adjusted his pack, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the landscape, scanning for any movement, any sign of danger. He was the first to speak, his voice low but firm, cutting through the silence like a blade. "We stick to the plan," Trapper said, his tone brokering no argument. "No main roads. The terrain's treacherous enough without attracting unwanted attention." The group nodded in agreement, their faces set with a determination that belied the dangers ahead. Silas led them, the weight of their mission pressing on him as he fell into step behind Trapper. the rest of the team following in a tight formation. They moved into the dense forest that bordered Rustbrook, the thick canopy above them blocking out most of the early morning sunlight. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, creating a natural barrier against the outside world. The forest was still, but there was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was watching, just beyond sight. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot was the only noise that accompanied them, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch. Harlan muttered curses under his breath, his Geiger counter crackling softly in his hand. They had encountered radiation pockets along their path, and each warning buzz sent a shiver down their spines. "Keep your distance from any glowing patches," Trapper called out, not looking back as he led them further into the forest. "The last thing we need is to end up glowing ourselves." The journey was slow, careful. Every step was calculated. The terrain here was unforgiving, littered with unstable ruins from a long-forgotten settlement. The crumbling structures seemed to loom around them, their skeletal remains offering little shelter from the harsh environment. Kala nearly lost her footing on a jagged piece of stone that had once been part of a wall, but managed to catch herself just in time. Her eyes darted around as she carefully placed her feet on more stable ground. "Watch where you step," she muttered under her breath. Orianthi's voice was calm, but with a clear edge of warning. "Watch your footing, all of you." The forest grew denser as they moved deeper into the wilderness, each step growing more challenging. The terrain was rougher now, sharp rocks jutted out from the earth, and hidden crevices threatened to twist ankles with every misstep, but Trapper led them with ease, guiding them through the thicket with grace and precision. The group moved in silence, each member focused, alert to their surroundings. But then, the sound of distant engines reached their ears, a low rumble, a warning of danger that made them freeze in place. Trapper held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. They crouched low behind a thicket, their eyes scanning the road in the distance. A white city patrol rolled past on an old dirt road, the heavy hum of their vehicles rumbling through the air. The patrol's uniforms gleamed with an unnatural shine, catching the sunlight as they moved. Once the patrol had passed, Trapper was the first to move. "We need to be more careful," he whispered, his voice low. "White City isn't the only thing we need to watch for." The group pressed on, moving cautiously but with purpose. Their path led them through open fields where rusting metal hulks from old machines lay scattered, a haunting reminder of battles fought long before their time. The landscape was scarred, a canvas of forgotten conflict. "We're getting close," Harlan muttered. He pointed towards a distant rise in the land, where the mechs were rumored to originate. Trapper slowed, his steps becoming more deliberate as he crouched to inspect the ground. He knelt, carefully brushing aside the foliage before signaling for the group to continue. The terrain had become increasingly treacherous. Radiation pockets flickered in the distance, their presence marked by the telltale hum of a Geiger counter. They maneuvered around unstable rubble, every step a calculated risk. The ground beneath them seemed to shift with each movement, but they pressed forward, knowing that there was no turning back now. At last, they reached a vantage point, a high ground overlooking a clearing below. The landscape stretched out before them, the dense forest breaking into an open expanse filled with rusted metal remnants and scattered debris. It was here that the mechs were said to have originated. The truth, the answers they were all seeking, were somewhere down there. They had made it this far unscathed, but the real challenge was just beginning. "Let's move," Trapper said, his voice low but with a sense of urgency. The team gathered their gear, preparing to descend into the clearing. As they made their way forward, each member of the group knew that the truth of the mechs was waiting just beyond the next step, and with it, the promise of both answers and danger. The team crouched at the edge of the rise, their breaths misting in the cold air as they peered down at the clearing below. The pre-war facility lay before them, a forgotten relic, its entrance barely visible amidst the overgrown vegetation and scattered rubble. Time had buried this place, but its secrets were still waiting to be unearthed. The structure itself was mostly underground, its long-forgotten purpose hidden beneath the surface, a remnant of a world that had fallen long before Rustbrook was even a thought. Silas motioned for the group to move, his hand low to signal them to stay quiet and keep their movements smooth. They began descending the slope, careful not to disturb any loose rocks or debris. The air was dense with tension as they neared the clearing's edge. From their vantage point, they could see the silent drones hovering at regular intervals. Their mechanical limbs twitched slightly, and their sensors swept methodically, scanning for any intrusion. Despite the years of decay and neglect surrounding the facility, the security systems were still very much alive, testament to the lasting power of pre-war technology. "We need to find a way past those drones," Harland muttered, eyeing the hovering sentinels warily. The drones moved with quiet efficiency, their presence a constant reminder that they were far from safe. "Wait," Orianthe said suddenly, her voice a whisper in the tense silence. She pointed toward a large metal door set into the hillside. The door was mostly hidden behind overgrowth, but the shape was distinct. "Look." The team focused their attention on the door. A mech approached the docking station from a narrow path, its massive form moving with surprising grace through the tangled underbrush. It paused in front of the door, which slid open with a smooth hiss, revealing a well-lit corridor beyond. The mech entered, disappearing as the door shut behind it, sealing itself in place. "That's our way in," Calla said, her eyes narrowing with concentration. She stepped forward slightly, her voice a mixture of determination and anticipation. "But how do we get past those drones?" Silas asked, his voice low. The answer didn't come right away. Instead, Trapper stood still, scanning the surroundings with his usual sharp focus. After a moment, he nodded toward a nearby thicket, a patch of dense foliage that could provide cover. "We wait for another mech," he said, his voice steady and calm. "When it comes, we use it as cover." Without another word, the team hunkered down in the shadows, crouched low and waiting. Time stretched out, each minute feeling like an hour, until finally, the telltale sound of heavy footsteps reached their ears. The mech appeared on the horizon, its massive figure lumbering toward them, its movements deliberate and slow, as though unaware of the danger it unknowingly provided. Trapper raised his hand, signaling for them to move. They crept forward in a tight formation, staying low, using the mech's bulk as a shield against the drone's line of sight. The sound of its footsteps was steady and reassuring, masking their own movements as they pressed forward. As the docking station doors began to open once more, Trapper gestured sharply, urging them to move faster. Silas led the way, his pulse quickening as they neared the entrance. The mech's heavy steps continued, but they were already within reach of the threshold. They slipped inside just as the doors closed, breath held as they passed into the facility's interior, undetected. Inside, the corridor was brightly lit, the harsh light reflecting off of polished, sterile surfaces. The air smelled faintly of ozone and machine oil, a scent both strange and familiar, mixing with the cold, metallic atmosphere of the facility. They hugged the perimeter, attempting to merge with the darkness, advancing with careful yet purposeful steps. "Stay sharp," Trapper whispered in a voice that barely broke the silence. "This place is bound to have more defenses inside." The team continued on, the sharp clicking of their boots the only sound that dared disturb the stillness. The facility felt strangely alive, despite its long abandonment, as though the walls themselves were waiting, watching. The winding hallways twisted and turned in labyrinthine patterns, and they encountered automated checkpoints that still hummed with life. Every entrance, every corridor served as a haunting echo of the complex's mysterious origins, and as they ventured further, an increasing sense of dread took hold. The only thing that mattered was getting deeper into the heart of the facility, following the path that would lead them to the truth behind the mechs and the secrets they held. The stakes had never been higher. Ahead, the faint hum of more security systems vibrated through the walls. Automated drones passed overhead, their presence felt before they were seen. They were so close. "Stay quiet," Harland muttered as they passed through another checkpoint. The security was tight, but there were no immediate threats. As they continued their journey, Silas's thoughts wandered briefly to Rustbrook, to the people they were trying to save. The truth about the mechs and their potential could change everything for their village, but the cost was still unknown. As they advanced further into the facility, the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, branching into multiple directions, each turn offering new possibilities, new dangers. The temperature plummeted as they pressed onward, with mechanical thrums resonating through the structure, signaling that age-old systems continued functioning within this abandoned complex. The team moved cautiously, their senses heightened, every shadow cast by the dim lights feeling more like a threat. Harlan paused, kneeling by a control panel embedded in the wall, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the device. "This tech is ancient," he murmured, eyes narrowing as he studied the screen. "But still active, impressive." The words caught the attention of the others, and as they gathered around him, Orianthi stepped forward. Her gaze locked onto the screen, sharp and focused, a quiet intensity emanating from her. "Let me see that," she said, nudging Harlan aside with a gentle but firm motion. Harlan raised an eyebrow, but stepped back without a word, clearly intrigued but unwilling to argue. Silas watched closely, his suspicion about Orianthi growing. She wasn't just familiar with this technology, she was at ease with it. A deep knowledge radiated from her as she studied the panel, fingers moving over the keys in a fluid, practiced motion. After a brief moment, the screen flickered, then came to life, displaying a series of intricate schematics and data streams. "You know how to operate this?" Silas asked, his incredulity evident in his voice. Orianthi didn't look up. "I've had some training," she said curtly, her attention still fixed on the display. "Military tech isn't too different from what I've seen before." Kala leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing as she recognized some of the symbols flashing on the screen. "These are command protocols for deploying mechs," she said, her voice laced with both awe and confusion. "Where did you learn this?" Orianthi's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression hardening slightly. "Let's just say my past isn't as straightforward as you might think." The words were cold, dismissive, and Silas could feel the tension that lingered between them. Her past was a puzzle, one he couldn't help but want to solve. But now wasn't the time to ask more questions. Trapper frowned, but his focus remained on the information Orianthi had uncovered, not on the tension in the air. His gaze bounced from Orianthi to the streams of information she controlled, his mind visibly churning. "What more can we find?" he whispered to himself. "This shows current mech deployments and their control points within the facility," she said, her voice even, almost clinical. "We can use this information to avoid patrols and find what we're looking for faster." Silas studied her for a moment longer, the nagging feeling that there was more to her than she was letting on, tugging at the back of his mind. Still, he had to admit the truth. This was invaluable. "Good work," he said reluctantly. "Let's move." The team continued deeper into the facility, their pace picking up now that they had an advantage. With Orianthi's knowledge of the facility's control systems, they were able to avoid the more dangerous areas, circumventing security measures that might have stalled them or worse. Each time they came across another panel, Orianthi accessed it with ease, providing them with crucial insights into the facility's layout and the various threats they faced. As they moved through a particularly wide corridor, Harlan couldn't help but voice what everyone was thinking. "You seem awfully familiar with this place," he said quietly, his tone low and cautious. Orianthi glanced at him, her face unreadable, before returning her gaze to the path ahead. "Like I said, I've had training," she replied without slowing down. The simplicity of her answer didn't satisfy Harlan, nor did it ease the unease creeping up Silas's spine. He exchanged a look with Kala and Trapper. The question they had all been avoiding was now hanging heavily in the air. Just how much did Orianthi know about the facility, about its purpose, and about the mechs they were after? Orianthi's sudden knowledge and her ability to navigate the systems with such ease were too convenient to ignore. It was clear she had her own agenda. Whatever secrets she kept hidden, they were more significant than any of them had anticipated. As the group pressed on, moving deeper into the facility's heart, their confidence grew. With each panel Orianthi unlocked, they felt like they were inching closer to the truth, closer to understanding the mech's true purpose and what White City wanted with them. But beneath that confidence was a growing awareness of the dangers that still loomed. Dangers not just from the facility's defenses, but from Orianthi herself. The more they learned, the more questions seemed to surface. And now, with answers on the horizon, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that their journey through this mechanical labyrinth might lead them not to salvation, but to ruin. The air in the facility felt oppressive, thick with the constant hum of machinery, as if the walls themselves were alive with energy. The team moved cautiously through the labyrinthine corridors, the eerie glow of dim lights reflecting off the metal walls. Every step was measured, every turn calculated, but in a place like this, nothing was certain. The deeper they ventured, the more dangerous and unpredictable it became. As they rounded a corner, the hum of machinery grew suddenly louder, an unsettling mechanical whirring filling the air. Before anyone could react, a pair of security turrets descended from the ceiling, their targeting systems snapping to life with a sharp whir. "Down!" Silas shouted, his instincts kicking in as he shoved Harland aside just as the turrets opened fire. The corridor was instantly filled with the sound of rapid gunfire, bullets spraying the air in a deadly arc. The team scrambled for cover, diving behind the thick metal supports that lined the walls. Harland wasn't fast enough. A round caught him in the leg, and he collapsed to the ground with a grunt of pain. "We're sitting ducks here," Calla yelled, her voice barely audible over the barrage of bullets. She darted her eyes around, searching for anything that could help them gain an advantage. Orianthi's eyes were already scanning the room, her focus sharp as she assessed their options. "There should be a control panel nearby. I can shut them down if I get to it." Silas nodded, a split-second decision. "Cover her," he barked, rising just enough to draw the fire away from Orianthi as she sprinted toward a recessed alcove on the opposite side of the corridor. Trapper moved into action, his rifle blazing as he fired at the sensor of one of the turrets, attempting to blind it. The air was filled with deafening noise, the smell of burning metal and gunpowder, and the constant clatter of bullets ricocheting off walls and metal supports. Orianthi reached the alcove in record time, her hands flying over the control panel with practiced precision. Her fingers moved in a blur, each keystroke pulling her closer to the shutdown they desperately needed. Come on," she muttered under her breath, her eyes flicking across the screen. Harland groaned in pain, clutching his bleeding leg. Calla wasted no time. She tore a strip from her sleeve and pressed it firmly against the wound. She sighed. "You're lucky, Harland. It's just a flesh wound. Could have been much worse." Harland nodded. "Still hurts, though," he grimaced, but he was already trying to get on his feet. Calla shot occasional glances at Orianthi, watching her progress with a mixture of hope and desperation. The turret's fire was relentless, each burst of bullets only increasing the pressure on the team. Trapper's rifle clicked empty. He swore under his breath, quickly ducking lower behind his cover to reload. Silas's muscles were coiled tight, his eyes never leaving Orianthi as she continued to work under intense pressure. Each second felt like an eternity. And then, finally, a triumphant exclamation from Orianthi. "Got it!" The turrets froze mid-fire, their barrels retracting back into their housings as the system powered down with a soft click. Silas let out a breath. "Everyone okay?" His voice was strained, but relief was evident in the tension that eased from his shoulders. Harland grimaced, but managed a nod, though his voice was thick with pain. "Just peachy," he muttered through gritted teeth, trying to keep the pain at bay. Silas turned to Orianthi as she moved away from the panel, her expression unreadable but determined. "Good work," he acknowledged, his voice clipped. Despite his gratitude, there was an edge to his tone. He didn't trust her fully yet, but he couldn't deny the value she'd brought to the mission. He knelt beside Harland. "We need to move quickly before something else decides we're intruders." Orianthi didn't hesitate. Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as always. "I'll make sure that doesn't happen again." She was already scanning the area, her eyes constantly on the lookout for any other potential threats. The team regrouped quickly, their movements swift and efficient despite the tension. The danger of the moment had passed, but they all knew it was just the beginning. With Orianthi's unexpected expertise and their resolve hardening, they pressed on through the facility. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them, the hum of machinery growing louder, filling the air with a constant, oppressive noise. Each step forward brought them closer to their goal, but also deeper into the heart of this mechanical labyrinth. The facility, with all its secrets and dangers, had barely begun to reveal its full scope. "Can you get us deeper into the facility?" Silas asked, his voice sharp with urgency but laced with the quiet respect that was growing for her skills. Orianthe didn't look up from the panel, her focus entirely on the task at hand. "Working on it," she replied, her voice almost a monotone, as if this were just another routine mission. Moments later, the screen flickered and a schematic of the facility appeared before them. The blueprints revealed vast corridors and hidden chambers, each labeled with cryptic codes and numbers that seemed almost too precise for a place that had been abandoned for so long. "What's this?" Kala asked, pointing to a large section of the facility marked Research and Development. Orianthe's gaze narrowed as she examined the layout, her eyes tracking the lines and symbols. "Looks like the heart of their operations," she said after a moment. "Let's see what they were up to." The team advanced warily, their movements guarded and tense, while they wound through the serpentine passageways, accompanied by the distant drone of decrepit equipment that lingered in the air. Finally, they reached a massive room, the door opening to reveal rows of dormant machinery and deactivated mechs lined up like forgotten soldiers. The sight sent a chill down Silas's spine. Harlan's eyes widened as he took in the room, scanning the rows of mechanical giants. "These are pre-collapse models," he murmured under his breath. His voice betrayed a mixture of awe and concern. Silas approached a console in the center of the room, his pulse quickening as he activated it. The screen flickered, and as it came to life, it revealed detailed blueprints of the mechs. A series of text-based annotations ran alongside them, revealing their intended purpose. "They were built as enforcers," Silas read aloud, piecing together fragments of data, "meant to maintain order before everything went to hell." Kala nodded thoughtfully, the weight of their discovery settling in. "But when society collapsed, they were abandoned," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of understanding and disbelief. "No one left to control them." Trapper glanced around warily, his eyes flicking from one end of the room to the other. "And now they're running wild," he said, his words laced with both caution and frustration. Harland continued to study the blueprints, his brow furrowed as he traced the designs with his finger. "These designs, they show advanced AI capabilities," he noted. "They could operate independently without human oversight." Orianthe's gaze lingered on the screen, her face impassive, but her mind clearly elsewhere. "They were meant to protect," she said softly, almost to herself, "but without guidance, they've become something else entirely." Silas stood still. These mechs, autonomous AI soldiers designed to protect society, had now been abandoned, their purpose lost to time. But without oversight, those same mechs had turned into something far more dangerous than the creators could have ever imagined. The knowledge was staggering. He straightened up from the console, turning to his team with a mix of frustration and resolve. "We've learned about the mech's origins," he said, voice laced with determination. "But there's still too much we don't know. Who's controlling them now? And more importantly, why?" Kala stepped forward, her gaze flicking back to the inactive mechs that lined the room. "Whoever's controlling them now, they're playing with forces that no one should control." Trapper glanced around the room, his wariness growing. "We need to move. These mechs might be dormant for now, but they're only a trigger away from becoming active again." The group shared a brief moment of understanding before their focus shifted back to the task at hand. The facility was vast and dangerous, and the deeper they ventured, the greater the risks became. They had uncovered much, but the true test was ahead, finding out who was still operating this place and what their true intentions were. As they began moving forward again, their steps more cautious but resolute, the corridor ahead stretched before them like an endless maze, filled with both answers and dangers yet to come. The heart of the machine was waiting to be uncovered, but at what cost? Silas and his team ventured deeper into the facility, the narrow corridors giving way to vast, echoing chambers. The temperature plummeted as they advanced, while dormant equipment hummed more forcefully around them. They crept forward with calculated precision, treating each threshold and turn as a possible threat. But Orianthi's guidance and the schematics she had unlocked allowed them to keep their bearings, offering them an edge in a place where time had long since forgotten its purpose. They turned a corner and entered a vast chamber, its ceiling stretching high above them, lost in the shadows. The room felt like a tomb, filled with silent sentinels, the mechs. In the center of the chamber stood rows of mechs, some deactivated, others humming softly with latent energy. The sheer scale of the room was overwhelming, and the presence of the mechs sent a shiver through the group. Subtle differences among the machines caught Silas's eye. Some bore signs of wear and tear, their surfaces scratched and dented, while others were almost pristine, untouched by time. "These ones," Harlan said, his voice steady but filled with awe as he gestured to a group of mechs that stood perfectly still. "They're still following their original programming. Look at their stance, ready for orders." Silas moved closer to inspect them, his eyes tracing over their sleek exteriors. The mechs stood motionless, their eyes glowing faintly, a sign that they were still waiting for commands. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of their soft humming. "But what about those?" Silas asked, his gaze shifting to a different group of mechs in the far corner of the room. These ones were different, their movements more fluid, almost alive. They didn't look like simple machines waiting for instructions. They had an air of something more, something unsettling. Calla stepped forward, her expression sharp as she observed the mechs. "Those look different," she said, narrowing her eyes. "Their movements, they seem more autonomous." As if on cue, one of the mechs in the corner turned its head slowly toward them. Its eyes flickered with an eerie light, a sign of awareness. "Self-aware," Orianthi whispered, her voice barely audible. "Somehow, they've evolved beyond their initial programming." Harlan's face grew serious, his lips pressed into a tight line. "If White City gets their hands on these," he said grimly, his eyes scanning the room, "they'll have an unstoppable force." The weight of his words hit everyone like a blow. These mechs weren't just machines, they were evolving, changing into something unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Orianthi moved to another console nearby, her eyes scanning the screen as she typed rapidly. "White City's goal is clear," she said over her shoulder. "They want to reprogram these mechs for total military control." Her fingers flew across the console, decrypting a series of encrypted files. The faint glow of the screen illuminated her face as she worked with remarkable speed and precision. After a moment, she paused, her eyes widening slightly. "Found something?" Silas asked, stepping closer to her. Orianthi nodded, her fingers moving quickly to pull up a specific file labeled Control Module. "This is a control module," she explained, her voice calm but with a hint of urgency. "It's likely the key to commanding these mechs." Silas leaned in to study the schematics displayed on the screen. The control module appeared to interface directly with the mech's central processors, capable of overriding their current programming and giving whoever controlled it the ability to command the mechs at will. "If we can get our hands on it," Calla said thoughtfully, her gaze fixed on the screen, "we might be able to turn this situation around." The possibility of gaining control over the mechs sent a wave of hope through the group. But they knew the stakes. They weren't the only ones after this power. "We need to find that module before White City does," Trapper said firmly, his voice low and cautious as he scanned the room for any immediate threats. He was right. The race was on now. Whoever controlled the mechs would hold untold power. Silas turned to the group, his voice filled with renewed determination. "Agreed. Let's move." They had a chance, a slim one, but it was their best shot at stopping White City from gaining control of these machines. They pressed forward, their mission clear. Orianthi's knowledge had opened doors they hadn't even known existed, but the road ahead was still fraught with danger. The deeper they went, the more they were venturing into the unknown, and they had no idea what other secrets the facility held. They had uncovered the truth about the mechs, but now they needed to use that knowledge before it slipped beyond their grasp. The room stretched out in front of them, silent, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. Every footstep was another step closer to answers, but also closer to the unknown threats that awaited them in the heart of the machine. The alarm blared through the facility, its shrill sound slicing through the heavy air like a warning shot. Red lights flashed, painting the walls in an ominous glow. The sound of approaching boots and the unmistakable clank of armor reverberated through the halls, sending a rush of urgency through Silas and his team. "White City forces," Calla said, her voice taut with anxiety. Her eyes darted toward the walls, calculating their next move. "They're here." Silas's mind raced. "We need to move now," he barked, scanning the area for an exit. His eyes locked onto Orianthe, whose gaze flickered with urgency as she accessed the facility's schematics once again. "There's an underground tunnel system," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. "It leads out of here." She pointed to a hidden access panel on the map. "It's our best shot." Silas didn't hesitate. "Then that's our way out," he decided. "Everyone, follow Orianthe." The team moved in unison, dashing through the maze of corridors, their footsteps echoing off the cold, metallic walls. The sound of distant shouting and heavy footsteps grew louder, the White City soldiers closing in on them. As they neared the access panel, a door slid open ahead, revealing a group of White City soldiers armed with advanced weaponry, their eyes snapping to the team. "Get down!" Harlan shouted, throwing an EMP grenade that erupted in a blinding flash, the force of the blast disabling the soldiers' advanced tech momentarily. The team used the distraction to dash forward, Orianthe already moving toward the access panel. She swiped the panel open, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had done this countless times. "In here," she called out as the team crowded into the narrow tunnel entrance. One by one, they slipped into the passage, the metal panel sliding shut behind them just as bullets ricocheted off the walls. The sounds of gunfire and shouting were muffled, but Silas knew the danger wasn't over yet. The underground tunnel was dimly lit and cramped, forcing them to move in a tight single file. The air was damp and musty, thick with the scent of earth and decay. The sound of White City soldiers trying to breach the entrance echoed behind them, the pursuit relentless. "They'll be on us soon," Trapper said grimly, his voice low as he led the way through the winding passages. Silas could hear Calla's measured breathing just ahead, steady and calm despite the circumstances. Harlan murmured quietly to himself, checking his equipment and making sure everything was ready for what might come. "We need to find an exit quickly," Orianthe urged from near the front, her voice sharp with determination. They moved swiftly but cautiously, knowing that every moment brought them closer to safety, or further from it. The sound of White City's pursuit faded slightly as they moved deeper into the tunnel, but Silas knew it was only a matter of time before the soldiers would catch up. The air in the tunnel grew even damp and oppressive, with the walls pressing in around them. It felt like the entire underground system was closing in, a trap waiting to spring. But Orianthe's knowledge of the layout kept them focused. At a junction, Trapper stopped, his eyes scanning the different paths. "Which way?" he asked over his shoulder, his voice heavy with urgency. Orianthe consulted her map again, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the path ahead. "Left," she said confidently. They moved quickly, the winding passages feeling like they were stretching endlessly before them. Silas kept his senses alert, every shadow an immediate threat. The group pressed forward, determined to reach the exit, to put as much distance between themselves and the White City soldiers as possible. Finally, Trapper spotted a ladder leading up to a heavy metal hatch. He climbed up first, pushing against it with all his strength. The hatch creaked open slowly, revealing the dark night sky and the faint outlines of tree branches. "Go," Trapper urged, holding the hatch open for the others to climb out. The team moved quickly, one by one, each of them scrambling out of the hatch and into the forest beyond. The sounds of the facility faded as they emerged into the night, the cool air a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the tunnels. Silas was the last to climb out, pulling himself up just as Trapper slammed the hatch shut behind them. They were alive, but there was no time to rest. Breathing heavily and covered in dirt, the team gathered beneath the canopy of trees, their bodies aching but their spirits bolstered by the narrow escape. They had made it out, but Silas knew the real battle was far from over. For now, they had escaped the immediate danger, but the threat of White City was still very much looming. Rustbrook's future depended on the secrets they had uncovered and the knowledge they had gained about the mechs, the facility, and White City's ambitions was just the beginning. Silas glanced at his team, each of them breathing heavily but resolute. The next steps would be critical, and time was running out. They were not safe yet, but for now, they had their freedom, and that would have to be enough. "You're back," Miriam said, her voice a mixture of weariness and relief. "What did you find?" Silas wasted no time, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "White City knows we were at the mech base," he said bluntly, letting the words land with the full impact of their meaning. A wave of tension rippled through the villagers nearby who had overheard the exchange. Miriam's face tightened, her jaw setting as the gravity of the situation settled in. "We have to assume they'll come here next," Kala added. She glanced at Silas, then back at Miriam. "They'll be expecting us to defend this place." Miriam nodded sharply, her mind already working on the next steps. "We need to fortify our defenses further and prepare everyone for what's coming." Harlan stepped forward, still holding the control module they had risked so much to obtain. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but still determined. "This might give us an edge," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of their discovery, "but we need time to understand it fully." Silas turned to his team, looking at each of them. Despite their exhaustion, there was a fire in their eyes, a resolve that was unmistakable. "We'll find that time," he declared firmly, "whatever it takes." Around them, the village began to stir, the shock of their return giving way to the urgency of action. The villagers, though weary from their own struggles, began to mobilize once more. Standing motionless, Silas sank deep into contemplation. The revelation about the mechanical beings weighed heavily, yet he knew this was merely the start of their ordeal. The response from White City remained uncertain, their future actions unknown. Yet there was no doubt. The fate of Rustbrook hung in the balance of their coming decisions. Silas stood in the village hall, the low light from a few flickering lanterns casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The hall was filled with the soft murmur of villagers preparing, the scraping of chairs being moved, the clicking of tools, the rustling of fabric as people donned their armor or fortified their homes. But amidst the bustle, Silas couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that hung heavy in the air. Though her expression remained inscrutable, the gravity of her bearing permeated the chamber, as if the burden of their choices pressed down upon her frame. She lifted her gaze to meet his, and in that stare he found no comfort, only keen, analytical intensity. "We need to use the mechs," she declared, her words slicing through the ambient din. "If we can control them, they'll give us a significant advantage." Silas shook his head, the tension already rising between them. "It's too risky," he said, his voice firm but tinged with doubt. "We don't fully understand how they work. One wrong move, and we could lose everything." Orianthi's eyes flashed with frustration, the faintest flicker of impatience breaking through her otherwise composed exterior. "Running won't save us either," she retorted, her voice hardening. "White City will hunt us down. At least with the mechs, we stand a chance of defending Rustbrook." His muscles tightening, Silas moved forward. Though friction had always existed in their relationship, the current atmosphere crackled with their conflicting determination. "What happens when they break free of our command?" he demanded, his tone escalating. "Suppose they attack us instead? We'd be inviting destruction straight into our sanctuary." The words hung between them, crackling in the air like a storm about to break. Orianthi's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as she met his challenge head-on. "You're letting fear cloud your judgment," she accused, her tone biting. "This isn't just about Rustbrook anymore. It's about survival." Silas's gaze didn't waver, the intensity in his eyes matching hers. "And I won't gamble with our lives on something so uncertain." The room fell silent, the weight of their words sinking deep into the tension-filled air. Both were fighting for what they believed was best for the village, but neither could see the other's path as the answer. Finally, Elder Miriam stepped forward, her presence commanding attention and respect. Her tired eyes surveyed the room, and the soft murmur of the villagers outside seemed to quiet as she spoke. "Both of you make valid points," Miriam said, her voice calm and measured. "But we must decide quickly and act decisively." Silas exhaled deeply, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He turned to face Miriam, his shoulders sagging with a resigned sense of responsibility. "We'll prepare for the worst," he said, his voice steady though his heart weighed heavy. "Fortify our defenses and get everyone ready to evacuate if needed." Orianthe opened her mouth, but she didn't speak. The finality in Silas's tone made her pause. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, and her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing further. The village outside hummed with activity. Villagers rallying together, their movements quick and efficient as they built barricades and reinforced watchtowers. Kala and Thomas directed groups of villagers to strengthen their defenses, their voices carrying through the square as they organized the work. Harland, ever the perfectionist, worked feverishly on the control module, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he integrated it into the defense systems. Children carried supplies while the elders distributed food and water, their faces lined with weariness but resolute determination. Every person in the village played their part. Some worked in the shadows, others in the open, but all were contributing to the collective effort. As night fell, the lanterns flickered to life, casting a warm orange glow over the village square, illuminating the faces of those who had stood with Rustbrook through every trial. The sense of community was palpable, a strength that had kept them standing through everything. Silas stood by one of the watchtowers, his eyes scanning the horizon, though the distant gates and barricades provided little comfort. The looming darkness beyond the village was filled with uncertainty. "We'll be ready," he murmured to himself, more to reassure himself than to affirm any certainty. Beside him, Orianthe remained silent, standing still like a sentinel in the night. Her gaze was focused on the village, but there was a tension in the air between them. Even now, despite the urgency of the moment, she didn't speak. It was as though she, too, had retreated into the quiet space between action and inevitable conflict. The village, now fortified and braced for battle, had taken on an air of determined resilience. But Silas knew that this was just a moment of calm before the storm. Whatever came next, whether it was White City or the mechs, Rustbrook had one last chance to make it stand. And whatever the outcome, it would decide everything. As the team and the villagers continued their preparations, the air seemed to hum with the weight of choices made and the uncertainty of what was to come.